Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. I was motionless, eyes fixed on the aged wall, its cracks forming a map of unknown paths. The air seemed to tremble slightly, disturbed by a presence I couldn't see. A draft, maybe. The room was still, yet alive with the soft murmur of things settling in the silence. My heart synced with the occasional creak, each sound a question mark hanging in the air. I counted the beats until the quiet returned, each second stretching longer than the last. Then, as if responding to my unspoken question, a gentle rustle emerged, an unexpected note in the symphony of stillness. It came from the wall's other side, where nothing was supposed to be. The sound meant something. I knew it even then, though I couldn't name what, like recognizing a voice in a crowded room before you turn to see the face. The knowledge settled in my chest, heavy and certain, the way truth always does when it arrives uninvited. I had been living in this place for months by then, maybe longer. Time had become elastic, stretching and contracting without my permission. The small apartment felt both familiar and foreign, the way childhood homes do when you return as an adult. Everything the same size it had always been, yet somehow smaller. The walls closer together than memory suggested. The rustling came again, softer this time, paper perhaps, or fabric dragging against wood. I pressed my ear to the wall, feeling the cool plaster against my skin. The building was old, constructed when privacy was a luxury rather than an expectation. Thin walls, shared spaces, lives bleeding into one another through cracks and gaps. But the apartment next door had been empty since I moved in. The landlord had mentioned it in passing, the way people mention weather or traffic. Vacant for renovations, he said, or maybe he said it was between tenants. The details blurred together now, lost in the fog of ordinary conversation. I began to notice other things after that first sound, small disturbances in the rhythm of my daily life. A book I was certain I had left on the kitchen counter appearing on the coffee table. The faint smell of cigarettes drifting through the heating vents, though I had never smoked. Footsteps in the hallway that stopped just outside my door, lingering for heartbeats before moving on. Each incident was minor, easily dismissed. The kind of things that happen in old buildings, in lives lived too closely together. But they accumulated like sediment, building layers of unease that I couldn't shake. I found myself listening more intently to the sounds around me, cataloging each creak and whisper as if they might reveal some hidden pattern. The woman in the lobby had been watching me for weeks before I noticed. She sat in the same chair every afternoon, a newspaper spread across her lap, but her eyes tracked my movements as I checked the mail or climbed the stairs. When our gazes finally met, she smiled with the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to being caught staring. She began our conversation with the weather, as strangers do, but quickly moved to more personal territory. How long had I lived here? Did I enjoy the neighborhood? Was I settling in well? Her questions felt rehearsed, as if she had been preparing for this moment. I answered politely, offering the kind of surface details that satisfy curiosity without revealing anything meaningful. Then she mentioned the apartment next to mine. Such a shame about what happened there, she said, shaking her head with theatrical sadness. The previous tenant had been such a quiet person, kept to themselves, never caused any trouble. The kind of neighbor everyone appreciates until they're gone. I waited for her to elaborate, but she seemed to lose interest in the topic as suddenly as she had raised it. Instead, she folded her newspaper and excused herself, leaving me standing in the lobby with more questions than answers. The conversation felt incomplete, like a song that ends mid-chorus. That night I lay in bed listening to the building settle around me. Old structures have their own language, a vocabulary of groans and sighs that speaks of shifting foundations and settling timber. But among the familiar sounds I heard something else. A rhythmic tapping, soft but persistent, coming from the wall beside my bed. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, too regular to be accidental, too deliberate to ignore. I counted the intervals, trying to discern a pattern. The sound would continue for minutes, then stop abruptly, leaving me straining to hear its return. When it finally resumed, sometimes hours later, it felt like a conversation I couldn't quite join. I began to research the building's history during my lunch breaks, scrolling through property records and newspaper archives on my phone. The information was sparse, fragmented pieces of a puzzle I wasn't sure how to assemble. Built in the 1940s, converted to apartments in the 70s. A handful of minor violations over the years, nothing unusual for a building its age. But buried in the records, I found a brief mention of an incident from several months earlier. Police called to investigate a wellness check. No details, just a case number and a notation that the matter had been resolved. The address matched my building, though the specific apartment wasn't listed. I tried to push the discovery from my mind, but it lingered like a splinter, small but impossible to ignore. The tapping continued nightly, sometimes accompanied by other sounds. The scrape of furniture being moved, the whisper of footsteps on bare floors, the soft thud of something being set down with care. During the day, I found myself studying the wall that separated my apartment from the empty one next door. The paint was newer in some spots, as if repairs had been made recently. Small patches where the color didn't quite match, evidence of work done in haste or without attention to detail. I ran my fingers along the surface, feeling for inconsistencies, though I couldn't say what I hoped to find. The building superintendent was a man of few words, more comfortable with tools than conversation. When I mentioned the sounds from next door, he nodded absently and muttered something about old pipes and settling foundations. His dismissal felt practiced, as if he had given the same explanation many times before. But his eyes avoided mine as he spoke, and he seemed eager to end the conversation. When I pressed for more details about the vacant apartment, he claimed ignorance. Renovations were handled by outside contractors, he said. He wasn't privy to the specifics of their work or timeline. The woman from the lobby appeared again a few days later, this time in the hallway outside my apartment. She was examining the numbers on the doors as if confused about her destination. When she saw me approaching, her face brightened with recognition. She apologized for bothering me, explaining that she was looking for someone who used to live in the building. An old friend she had lost touch with, someone she hoped to reconnect with after all these years. The description she gave was vague, generic enough to fit almost anyone. Average height, quiet demeanor, kept irregular hours. I told her I hadn't met many of my neighbors yet, which was true. The building seemed designed to discourage interaction, with narrow hallways and doors that opened directly onto the corridor. People came and went like shadows, present but not engaged. She thanked me for my time and turned to leave, then paused as if remembering something important. "Be careful about getting too attached to this place," she said. "Sometimes buildings hold onto things longer than they should." Her words felt like a warning, though I couldn't determine what she was warning me against. That night the tapping was louder, more insistent. I pressed my ear to the wall and could swear I heard breathing on the other side. slow, measured breaths that matched the rhythm of the taps. 3 breaths, pause, 3 breaths, pause. A pattern that felt almost like Morse code, though I had never learned to decipher such signals. I began tapping back, mimicking the rhythm I heard. The sounds from the other side stopped immediately, as if whoever was there had been startled by my response. For several minutes, silence stretched between us like a held breath. Then, tentatively, the tapping resumed, softer this time, questioning rather than demanding. We continued this strange conversation for what felt like hours. I would tap, then listen for a response. Sometimes the answer came immediately, other times after long pauses that left me wondering if I had imagined the entire exchange. The pattern evolved, becoming more complex, more nuanced, a dialogue in a language neither of us fully understood. I fell asleep with my hands still pressed against the wall and woke to find my fingers numb from the cold. The building's heating system was inconsistent, leaving some rooms too warm while others remained perpetually chilled. But the cold I felt seemed to emanate from the wall itself, as if the space beyond was somehow drawing warmth from my apartment. The next morning I noticed that one of the patches of newer paint had begun to peel, a small section near the baseboard where moisture had worked its way behind the surface. I picked at the edge with my fingernail, and a larger piece flaked away, revealing older paint beneath, dark red, almost burgundy, the color of dried blood. I told myself it was just paint, probably from decades earlier when color choices were different, but the sight of it made my stomach tighten with unease. I pressed the loose piece back into place, smoothing it with my thumb until it lay flat against the wall. The repair was temporary, I knew. Moisture would continue to work its way through, eventually revealing whatever lay beneath. The woman from the lobby was waiting for me when I returned from work that evening. She sat in her usual chair, but her newspaper remained folded in her lap, unread. Her attention was focused entirely on the elevator doors, as if she had been counting the minutes until my return. She approached me before I could reach the mailboxes, her movements quick and purposeful. There was something different about her demeanor, an urgency that hadn't been present in our previous encounters. She spoke in whispers, glancing around the empty lobby as if afraid of being overheard. She told me she had been thinking about our conversation, about the friend she had been trying to locate. There were things I should know, she said, details that might be important for my safety, but not here, not where others might listen. Could we speak somewhere more private? I hesitated, uncertain whether to trust her obvious concern or be wary of her secretive approach. But curiosity won over caution, and I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop several blocks away. She suggested we go separately, arriving at different times to avoid drawing attention. The precaution seemed excessive, but I agreed. The coffee shop was nearly empty when I arrived, just a few students with laptops and an elderly man reading a newspaper. The woman was already there, seated at a corner table with a clear view of the entrance. She had chosen her position carefully, I realized, somewhere we could talk without being overheard while still monitoring who came and went. She began by apologizing for the drama, explaining that she wasn't naturally secretive, but circumstances had made her cautious. The friend she had been looking for wasn't really a friend, she admitted, more of an acquaintance, someone she had known only briefly, but whose disappearance had troubled her. The person had lived in the apartment next to mine, she explained, a quiet individual who kept regular habits and rarely had visitors, the kind of neighbor you notice precisely because they're so unremarkable, until one day they simply weren't there anymore. At first, no one was concerned. People move without warning, especially renters who aren't tied to long-term leases. But weeks passed without any sign of activity in the apartment. Mail accumulated in the lobby, and the superintendent began receiving complaints about strange smells coming from that unit. The wellness check had been her idea, she confessed. She had contacted the building management, who eventually called the police. But when officers arrived, they found the apartment empty. No sign of struggle, no indication of anything amiss, just the normal detritus of someone who had packed quickly and left. The official explanation was that the tenant had broken their lease and abandoned the apartment. It happened more often than people realized, she was told. Financial problems, family emergencies, relationship troubles, any number of reasons might prompt someone to leave without notice. But she hadn't been satisfied with that explanation. The person she remembered wouldn't have left without settling their affairs, wouldn't have abandoned personal belongings or left bills unpaid. Something about the situation felt wrong, though she couldn't articulate exactly what. She had tried to investigate on her own, asking questions of other tenants and building staff, but her inquiries were met with shrugs and dismissals. People seemed eager to forget about the missing neighbor, to accept the simple explanation and move on with their lives. That's when she began watching the apartment, noting who came and went. Maintenance workers, she assumed, or contractors hired to prepare the unit for new tenants. But their visits seemed random, uncoordinated. Sometimes they stayed for hours, other times just minutes, and she never saw them remove anything substantial, no furniture or boxes of belongings. Then I had moved in next door, and she had begun watching me as well. Not out of suspicion, she was quick to clarify, but out of concern. She worried that whatever had happened to the previous tenant might somehow affect me. The building had secrets, she believed, and some secrets could be dangerous. I listened to her story with growing unease, recognizing details that aligned with my own experiences. The sounds from next door, the superintendent's evasive responses, the sense that information was being deliberately withheld. But I also wondered about her motives, whether her concern was genuine or if she had some other agenda. When I asked what she thought had really happened to the missing tenant, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned forward, lowering her voice even further. She thought the person might still be in the building, she said, hidden somewhere, unable or unwilling to leave. The sounds I had been hearing weren't from an empty apartment, but from someone trapped inside. The suggestion seemed absurd, the stuff of urban legends and conspiracy theories. But as I walked home through the darkening streets, I found myself considering the possibility. The tapping had been too regular, too purposeful to be explained by settling timber or old pipes. And the breathing I had heard, the way the sounds responded to my own taps, suggested conscious intent. Back in my apartment, I stood before the wall with new awareness. If someone was on the other side, they would be living in conditions I could barely imagine. No electricity, limited access to water, surviving on whatever food they could obtain without detection. It would require determination bordering on desperation. But why would someone choose such an existence? What could drive a person to hide rather than simply leave? I thought about the woman's description of the missing tenant, someone who kept regular habits and paid their bills on time, not the profile of someone who would vanish without explanation. Unless they hadn't chosen to vanish. Unless something had happened that made leaving impossible. I pressed my ear to the wall and listened. For a long time there was only silence. Then, so faint I might have imagined it, I heard the soft rustle of movement. Someone shifting position, trying to find comfort in an uncomfortable space. The sound was achingly human, vulnerable in a way that made my chest tight with sympathy. I tapped gently on the wall, 3 soft knocks that wouldn't carry beyond the immediate area. The response came quickly, 3 taps in return, then a pause followed by a longer sequence. 5 taps, then 7, then 3 again. Numbers, perhaps, or letters, some kind of code I couldn't decipher. I tried to respond in kind, tapping out my own sequences and listening for replies. But without understanding the system being used, our exchange remained frustratingly limited. I could sense intelligence on the other side, someone trying to communicate complex ideas through the crude medium of sound. But the message remained locked away, inaccessible. Over the following nights, our conversations became more elaborate. The person on the other side seemed to understand that I was listening, that I wanted to help. They began using different rhythms and intensities, creating a vocabulary of taps and pauses that gradually became familiar. I started to recognize patterns, to anticipate certain sequences. But I still couldn't determine what they were trying to tell me. Sometimes the tapping seemed urgent, demanding immediate attention. Other times it was gentle, almost conversational. Occasionally it stopped altogether for hours, leaving me wondering if something had happened or if the person had simply fallen asleep. I considered calling the police, reporting what I had discovered, but what could I tell them? That I heard sounds from an apartment they had already investigated and found empty. That I believed someone was hiding there based on a pattern of taps that could easily be explained by building settling or pipe expansion. The woman from the lobby had given me her phone number, scrawled on a napkin at the coffee shop. I stared at it for a long time, debating whether to call. She had seemed genuinely concerned, but there was something about her story that didn't quite align. Too many convenient coincidences, too much detailed knowledge for someone who claimed to be merely a concerned neighbor. Instead, I decided to investigate on my own. The next morning, I waited in the hallway until I was sure no one else was around, then examined the door to the apartment next to mine. It looked ordinary enough, painted the same institutional beige as all the other doors in the building. But when I knelt to examine the lock, I noticed fresh scratches around the keyhole. Someone had been opening this door recently. I tried the handle, expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily in my hand. The door opened just a crack before catching on something, a chain or deadbolt engaged from the inside. But the gap was wide enough to see into the apartment, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The space wasn't empty as I had been told. Furniture remained in place, covered with sheets but clearly present. Personal belongings sat on shelves and tables, gathering dust but undisturbed. This wasn't an abandoned apartment being prepared for new tenants. This was someone's home, preserved exactly as they had left it. I called softly through the crack, asking if anyone was there. My voice echoed in the empty space, but there was no response. I waited, listening for any sign of movement, but heard only the familiar sounds of the building settling around me. The chain on the door puzzled me most. It was engaged from the inside, which meant someone had to be in the apartment to have set it. But my calls had gone unanswered, and I could see no sign of recent habitation. The air that drifted through the crack smelled stale, undisturbed. I returned to my own apartment with more questions than answers. The tapping resumed that night, but now it carried different meaning. I knew the person on the other side had access to the apartment next door, but their presence there remained mysterious. Were they hiding during the day, emerging only at night? Were they trapped somehow, unable to respond to my calls? I began leaving small offerings at the door, bottled water, packaged snacks, anything that might help someone surviving in difficult conditions. Each morning I would check to see if the items had been taken. Sometimes they disappeared, other times they remained untouched. There seemed to be no pattern to determine which offerings would be accepted. The woman from the lobby called me several days later, asking if I had noticed any changes in the building. Her voice carried an edge of anxiety that hadn't been present during our coffee shop meeting. She had been watching the apartment next to mine, she said, and had seen lights moving inside during the night, just brief flashes as if someone was using a flashlight to navigate in the dark. I told her about finding the door unlocked and the apartment still furnished. She was quiet for a long moment, then asked if I had gone inside. When I said no, she seemed relieved. It might be dangerous, she warned. If someone was hiding there, they might not welcome intrusion. Desperate people could be unpredictable. Her concern felt genuine, but I sensed she was withholding information. There was more to the story of the missing tenant, details she hadn't shared during our previous conversations. I pressed her for more specifics, but she claimed to have told me everything she knew. After we hung up, I stood at my window looking down at the street. The building across from ours had large windows that offered a clear view into my apartment. I wondered who else might be watching, what other eyes had noted my comings and goings. The city was full of observers, people who noticed things but rarely acted on what they saw. That night the tapping was different, more urgent, more insistent. Instead of the usual 3-tap pattern, I heard long sequences that seemed to spell out words or phrases. I grabbed a pen and paper, trying to transcribe the rhythms into some kind of notation, but the patterns were complex, layered with meaning I couldn't decode. I tapped back, trying to communicate my frustration at not understanding. The response was immediate, a series of short, sharp taps that sounded almost like laughter. Then silence, as if the person on the other side was considering how to make themselves clearer. What came next was simpler. Single taps spaced evenly apart. I counted them 26, the number of letters in the alphabet, then a pause followed by 8 taps. The 8th letter, H, another pause, 5 taps, E, then 12 taps, L16, P. Help, the message was unmistakable once I understood the system. Someone was asking for my assistance, using the most basic code possible to ensure I would comprehend. I tapped back the same sequence, letting them know I had received their message. The response came quickly. 14 taps, N15, O20, T16, P15, O12, L9, I3, C5, E. Not police, they were warning me against involving law enforcement, though I couldn't understand why. If they were trapped or in danger, surely official help would be preferable to whatever assistance I could provide. I tapped out a question, WHY, why not police? The answer took longer to arrive, as if they were carefully considering their response. When it came, it was just 2 letters, repeated over and over. N-O, N-O, N-O. The desperation in that repetition was palpable, even through the crude medium of tapped code. I tried a different approach, WHOAREYOU. This time there was no response. I waited for nearly an hour, tapping the question again periodically, but the silence stretched on. Either they had fallen asleep, or the question itself had driven them away. The next morning I found a note slipped under my door. The paper was yellowed with age, and the handwriting was shaky, as if written by someone with limited light or an unsteady hand. The message was brief. Thank you for listening. Please don't let them know you can hear me. The pronoun was deliberately vague. Them, not him or her, but them. Multiple people, apparently, who represented some kind of threat. I thought about the maintenance workers the woman had mentioned, the people who came and went from the apartment at irregular intervals. Were they the ones I was being warned against? I kept the note, hiding it in a book on my shelf. The paper felt fragile between my fingers, as if it might crumble if handled too roughly. The person who had written it was clearly in distress, living in conditions that made even simple communication difficult. Over the following days, more notes appeared, always slipped under my door during the night, always written on the same yellowed paper. They told a story in fragments, pieces of information that I had to assemble into a coherent narrative. The missing tenant hadn't left willingly. They had discovered something about the building, some secret that certain people wanted to keep hidden. When they had tried to investigate further, they had been warned to stop. When they had persisted, they had been threatened. Rather than leave, they had chosen to hide. The apartment next door had a hidden space, a section that didn't appear on the building's official floor plans. It was accessible through a panel in the bedroom wall, concealed behind furniture that could be moved when necessary. They had been living there for months, surviving on food and water obtained during brief forays into the main apartment. But their situation was becoming increasingly precarious. The people who wanted them gone were growing more aggressive in their search. They had keys to the apartment and came by regularly, looking for signs of habitation. It was only a matter of time before the hiding place was discovered. The notes painted a picture of paranoia and desperation, but they also raised questions about the author's mental state. The claims seemed far-fetched, the stuff of conspiracy theories rather than reality, but the evidence of someone's presence next door was undeniable, and the fear in those shaky letters felt genuine. I began to research the building more thoroughly, looking for any information about hidden spaces or architectural anomalies. Old buildings often had such features, spaces that had been sealed off during renovations or forgotten over time. If someone knew about them, they could potentially use them as hiding places. The building's original blueprints were on file with the city, but accessing them required a formal request that might draw unwanted attention. Instead, I tried to find information through less official channels. Historical societies, architectural forums, websites dedicated to urban exploration. The search was time-consuming and often fruitless, but gradually I began to piece together the building's history. It had been constructed during wartime, when materials were scarce and building codes were less strictly enforced. Several modifications had been made over the decades, walls moved and spaces reconfigured to accommodate changing needs. It was entirely possible that some areas had been lost in the process, spaces that existed but weren't reflected in current documentation. The woman from the lobby called again, this time sounding genuinely frightened. She had seen people watching the building, she said. Men in dark clothing who stood across the street for hours, apparently monitoring who came and went. When she had tried to approach one of them, he had walked away without explanation. She was beginning to think her investigation into the missing tenant had attracted dangerous attention. Maybe we should drop the whole thing, she suggested. Some mysteries were better left unsolved, especially when solving them might put innocent people at risk. But I couldn't let it go. The notes continued to appear, each one more desperate than the last. The person next door was running out of food and water. The hidden space was cramped and uncomfortable, barely large enough for one person to survive. They were weakening, both physically and story too. The curtains swayed once before settling back. My fingertips brushed the thick fabric as I tried to sense the weight in the room. A low hum resonated beneath the floorboards, like a memory insisting on being felt. The air felt cooler, but still pressed close against my skin. I couldn't pinpoint why my heart quickened, only that it did. And in that moment, the carpet seemed to shift beneath my feet, as if nudging a secret to the surface. I'd come to clean out the house after the accident. That's what everyone called it, the accident. My relative had fallen down the stairs during the storm, they said. The power was out. The steps were slick from the rain coming through that loose window upstairs. A simple tragedy, the kind that happens to elderly people living alone in old houses with steep staircases and poor lighting. The funeral had been small. I'd handled the arrangements, signed the papers, listened to the neighbors express their condolences. They all told the same story, how they'd heard the sirens that night, seen the ambulance lights cutting through the storm. The paramedics had done everything they could, but the injuries were too severe. A broken neck, they said, quick and painless. Standing in that living room now, surrounded by decades of accumulated belongings, I could picture it clearly. The storm would have been howling outside, rattling the windows. The house would have been dark except for whatever candles or flashlights were available. Maybe my relative had been going upstairs to check that loose window, worried about water damage. The wooden steps would have been treacherous in the dark, especially for someone whose balance wasn't what it used to be. I'd found a half-melted candle on the kitchen counter, wax pooled around its base, evidence of that night's power outage. The logical progression of events seemed clear enough. Darkness, concern about the storm damage, a careful but ultimately fatal climb up unfamiliar stairs in poor conditions. But as I moved through the rooms, something felt displaced. Not wrong exactly, just shifted somehow. The coffee table sat at an odd angle to the couch, as if it had been moved recently. I couldn't remember it being that way during my previous visits, though I couldn't be certain. Memory has a way of rearranging details. The scent in the air was wrong too. Beneath the expected mustiness of a house that had been closed up for weeks, there was something else, something sharp and metallic that made my throat tighten. I told myself it was just the old pipes, or maybe cleaning products the neighbors had used when they'd helped tidy up after the paramedics left. I climbed the stairs myself, testing each step. They seemed solid enough, though the wood was worn smooth from decades of use. At the top, I found the window everyone had mentioned, the one with the loose frame that let rain in during storms. I pressed my palm against it, feeling how it gave slightly under pressure. Yes, this would definitely leak during bad weather. The bedroom showed signs of that night's storm. Water stains darkened the hardwood floor beneath the window, and I could see where towels had been placed to soak up the worst of it. Someone had cleaned up, but the evidence remained. This supported the theory about why my relative might have come upstairs during the storm. Yet something nagged at me as I stood there. The water damage seemed limited, contained to a small area directly below the window. If the storm had been severe enough to create dangerous conditions throughout the house, wouldn't there be more widespread evidence? The rest of the bedroom appeared untouched by the weather. I descended the stairs more slowly, paying attention to each step. About halfway down, I paused. My hand gripped the banister tighter than necessary, and I realized my breathing had quickened. There was no logical reason for this reaction, but my body seemed to remember something my mind couldn't access. The feeling passed, and I continued downstairs. I spent the rest of that afternoon sorting through papers and personal belongings, preparing them for donation or disposal. The work was methodical, soothing even. Each item had its place in the story of a life lived fully. Photographs, books, correspondence, small treasures collected over the years. But as evening approached and the light began to fade, the house seemed to settle around me in ways that felt unfamiliar. The floorboards creaked in patterns I didn't recognize. Shadows fell at angles that seemed wrong for the furniture arrangement. I found myself glancing over my shoulder repeatedly, though I couldn't say why. That night I dreamed of footsteps, not the heavy, uncertain steps of someone navigating dark stairs during a storm, but quick, purposeful movement. In the dream, I was standing at the bottom of the staircase, looking up. The footsteps were descending, but I couldn't see who was making them. The The sound grew louder, more urgent, until I woke with my heart racing. The next day brought a different kind of unease. I'd returned to continue clearing out the house, but things seemed to have shifted overnight. The coffee table, which I'd straightened the day before, was back at its odd angle. A book I'd placed in the donation pile was sitting open on the kitchen counter. Small changes that could be explained by settling, by my own imperfect memory, by any number of rational causes. But my hands were shaking as I made coffee that morning, using the same mug my relative had favored. The ceramic felt heavier than it should, and the coffee tasted bitter despite the cream I'd added. I set it down without finishing it, noticing how the liquid trembled slightly in the cup. The neighbors had been helpful, they'd said. After the ambulance left, they'd come over to secure the house, to make sure everything was locked up properly. They'd moved some furniture to make room for the paramedics, cleaned up the worst of the storm damage upstairs. Their kindness explained the small displacements I was noticing. Yet when I tried to picture this scene, neighbors moving through the house in the aftermath of tragedy, setting things right, the image felt wrong somehow. Like a photograph where the lighting doesn't match the supposed time of day. The details were plausible individually, but together they created a composition that my instincts rejected. I called one of the neighbors that afternoon, thanking them for their help that night. They were gracious, dismissive of my gratitude. Anyone would have done the same, they said. But when I asked about specific details, which furniture they'd moved, what cleaning they'd done, their answers became vague. The trauma of the situation, they explained, nobody remembers clearly in circumstances like that. Their uncertainty should have been reassuring. It matched my own confused recollections and fragmented impressions. Instead, it left me feeling more isolated, as if I were the only person asking questions that everyone else had agreed not to pursue. That evening I found myself standing at the foot of the stairs again. The logical story remained unchanged: storm, darkness, accident, but my body was telling me something different. My pulse quickened as I looked up toward the landing. My palms grew damp. Some primitive part of my nervous system was responding to signals I couldn't consciously detect. I forced myself to climb the stairs once more, but this time I paid attention to my physical reactions rather than the logical evidence. Halfway up, that same spot where I'd paused before, my breathing became shallow, not from exertion, but from something that felt like recognition. Like my body remembered being here before, under different circumstances. At the top of the stairs, I turned to look back down. The angle was steeper than I'd realized. A fall from here would indeed be serious, potentially fatal. But as I stood there, another image superimposed itself over the scene. Not someone falling accidentally, but someone being pushed. The vision was brief, more sensation than sight, but it left me gripping the banister until my knuckles went white. I told myself this was just my imagination, fed by too many crime documentaries and too much time alone in a house touched by tragedy. Grief and isolation can create false memories, phantom sensations, conspiracy theories where none exist. The mind seeks patterns and narratives even when reality is simply random and cruel. But that night I dreamed again. This time I was at the top of the stairs, looking down at someone climbing toward me. The figure was indistinct, but their movement was purposeful, determined. In the dream, I felt afraid not of falling, but of being found. I tried to back away from the stairs, but my feet wouldn't move. The person kept climbing, getting closer, and I woke gasping. The final day I spent in the house, I moved through it like someone saying goodbye. I'd packed everything of value, arranged for donations, scheduled the cleaning service. Soon it would be empty, ready for sale. The accident would become just another piece of its history, a sad story the realtor might mention to potential buyers. But as I did my final walkthrough, the house seemed to be offering me fragments of a different story. The way afternoon light fell across the living room revealed scuff marks on the hardwood floor, marks that suggested furniture had been dragged rather than carefully moved. The metallic scent I'd noticed was stronger near the stairs, concentrated in a way that seemed deliberate rather than incidental. In the kitchen, I found something I'd missed before, a small chip in the ceramic of the countertop, fresh enough that the exposed material hadn't yet dulled with age. It was positioned at exactly the height where someone might strike their head if they fell backward or were pushed. These observations felt significant, but I couldn't assemble them into a coherent alternative narrative. They remained fragments, suggestions, possibilities that dissolved when I tried to examine them directly. Like trying to see a dim star by looking slightly to one side, the truth seemed to exist only in my peripheral vision. As I prepared to leave the house for the last time, I stood once more in that living room where everything had begun. The curtains hung still now, no mysterious breeze to set them swaying. The carpet felt solid beneath my feet. The hum I'd heard that first day was gone, or perhaps I'd simply stopped listening for it. But the questions remained. Had I witnessed the aftermath of a tragic accident, or had I spent these days walking through the scene of something more deliberate? Were the inconsistencies I'd noticed evidence of a cover-up, or just the inevitable chaos that follows any sudden death? Did my body's reactions to certain spots in the house reflect suppressed memories, or were they simply the product of an overstimulated imagination? I locked the door behind me and walked away, carrying these uncertainties like stones in my pockets. The official story would stand: an elderly person, a storm, a fatal fall. The neighbors would remember their kindness in helping afterward. The house would be sold to a family who would create their own memories within its walls. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering about those final moments. Whether they were filled with the panic of someone losing their footing in the dark, or the terror of someone realizing they weren't alone in the house after all. Whether the last sound was the crack of breaking bones against hardwood, or something else entirely, a whispered word, a plea, a name called out in the darkness that no one was meant to hear. The truth, whatever it was, remains buried beneath the floorboards with that persistent hum, waiting for someone else to brush against the curtains and feel the weight of secrets settling in the air around them. Story 3. I mentioned I hadn't noticed the open window. They seemed satisfied, jotting down my words without a second glance. Yet the chill that clung to the air whispered otherwise, an insistent reminder of secrets left ajar. The gentle rustle of interrupted curtains lingered in the silence, a subtle breeze that carried a hint of lavender, fading but unmistaken. My eyes had caught the sun's hesitant dance on scattered papers, shapes misplaced yet eerily aligned. A draft caressed my cheek, unsettling and familiar, like a sigh caught mid-escape. I didn't mention the chill that ran deeper than the wind, and the paper cut on my finger was still fresh. The lavender comes back to me now, not the kind you buy in stores, but wild lavender, the kind that grows where it shouldn't, pushing through cracks in concrete, stubborn and sweet. I can smell it even when I'm nowhere near it, this phantom scent that makes my chest tighten. I was holding something, a photograph maybe, or a letter. The edges were sharp enough to slice skin if you weren't careful, if your hands were shaking. But that's not right. I was sitting at the desk when they arrived, wasn't I? My hands folded, composed, the picture of cooperation, the model witness. Except witnesses are supposed to have seen something, and I keep coming back to that word they used, noticed. What does it mean to notice, to become aware of something that was already there? The papers were scattered, yes, I remember that much, white sheets against dark wood like snow that had fallen in all the wrong places. Some face down, others crumpled. One had a coffee ring stain, perfectly circular, like a halo or a noose depending on how you looked at it. Someone had been looking for something. I told them about the routine, how everything was always in its place, how the papers were always stacked just so, corners aligned, weighted down with that glass paperweight shaped like a bird. A cardinal, I think, red as blood, red as lipstick, red as the roses that used to grow outside the window before they were cut back. The cardinal was on the floor when I found it, found them, found the room that way. But I'm getting ahead of myself, or behind myself. Time moves strangely when you're trying to remember what you've spent so long trying to forget. The window was open, I know this now, even though I said I hadn't noticed. The curtains were moving, that lazy dance curtains do when there's just enough breeze to make them restless, but not enough to make them wild. White curtains with small flowers embroidered along the hem. Violets, not lavender, though the scent was definitely lavender. I had a key, that's important, isn't it? You don't just walk into someone's space without permission. You don't just find yourself standing in a room full of scattered papers with a fresh cut on your finger and no clear memory of how either thing happened. The key was warm in my palm, warmer than it should have been, as if someone else had been holding it just before me, as if it had been passed from hand to hand like a secret. Did you touch anything? That was the question that made me pause, made me look down at my hands as if I'd never seen them before. The paper cut was thin, precise, not the jagged tear you get from handling rough edges carelessly, but the clean slice that comes from something deliberate. I touched the papers, didn't I, looking for something, or putting something back where it belonged. The lavender scent was stronger near the desk, concentrated there as if someone had spilled perfume or crushed the actual flowers against the wood. But there were no flowers in that room, just the embroidered violets on the curtains, and they were synthetic, decorative, lifeless. I keep coming back to the cardinal, the way it caught the light from the window, casting red shadows on the scattered papers. Red like a warning, red like guilt. It had been a gift, I think, something precious, handled with care, displayed with pride. Now it was just broken glass on hardwood, reflecting fragments of the room back at itself. Reflecting me. Did I pick up the pieces? Is that how I cut myself? The memory feels slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped palms. The harder I grasp, the more it slips away. There was music playing, soft, almost inaudible, coming from another room maybe, or from outside. Something classical, the kind of music that sounds like sadness wrapped in beauty. It made the silence in the room feel heavier, more complete. I was supposed to be there, that's what I told them, and it wasn't a lie. Not exactly. I had been invited in a way, expected. The key wouldn't have been where I could find it otherwise. Under the loose brick by the back door, wrapped in a piece of cloth that smelled like lavender. But invited when and by whom? The questions they didn't ask are louder than the ones they did. They wanted to know about the window, about what I had noticed, about whether anything seemed out of place. They didn't ask why I had come. They didn't ask what I was looking for among those scattered papers. They didn't ask about the lavender or the key or the way my hands were shaking when I called them. I remember dialing the number, my finger hovering over the buttons, hesitating. Once you make that call, there's no taking it back. Once you invite them in, they start asking questions you might not want to answer. The phone was old-fashioned, heavy in my hand, the kind with an actual dial that you had to turn for each number. It made a satisfying clicking sound, like small bones settling into place. like pieces of a puzzle finding where they belonged. Except nothing was finding where it belonged. Everything was scattered, displaced, wrong. The curtains kept moving, even after they arrived, even after they started taking pictures and asking questions and treating the room like a crime scene. The breeze never stopped, carrying that lavender scent in and out like a tide, like breathing. I wanted to close the window, to still the air and stop the papers from rustling every time someone walked by, but they told me not to touch anything else, to leave everything exactly as I had found it. As if I could remember exactly how I had found anything. The coffee stain on one of the papers had seeped through to the sheet below, a brown circle that looked like it had been there for a while, maybe days, but the coffee cup was gone, no mug on the desk, no ring of moisture on the wood, just the stain like evidence of something that had been erased. I used to drink coffee there, sitting in the chair by the window, watching the light change throughout the morning. The routine was comforting, predictable, safe. When did that stop? When did I stop being welcome in that space? The papers weren't random. I see that now looking back. There was a pattern to the scatter, a deliberate chaos, some face up, some face down, some crumpled, others pristine. Like someone had been sorting through them, making decisions about what mattered and what could be discarded. Or what could be hidden. I found myself reading the visible ones while we waited, words and phrases jumping out like accusations, never told me, should have known, too late now. Fragments of sentences that felt like fragments of conversations I might have had, or should have had, or was afraid to have. The handwriting was familiar, the slant of the letters, the way certain words were underlined for emphasis. I had seen it before, maybe on grocery lists or birthday cards or notes left on refrigerator doors. Casual communications from a time when communication was still possible. Before everything became questions and evasions and windows left open to let secrets escape. They asked if I recognized the handwriting. I said no, which was true in its way. Recognition implies understanding, and I understood nothing about what I was seeing. The words made sense individually, but lost all meaning when strung together, like a language I had once spoken fluently, but could now only half remember. The lavender was fading. As the room filled with people and equipment and official procedures, the scent grew weaker. Overwhelmed by other smells, coffee from a thermos, aftershave, the metallic tang of the camera flash. But I could still catch hints of it when the breeze shifted just right, still feel it pulling at something deep in my chest. Memory maybe, or guilt. I kept touching the cut on my finger, pressing it until it stung, until the pain was sharp enough to cut through the confusion. Real enough to anchor me to the present moment instead of letting me drift back into whatever fog had brought me there in the first place. The cardinal had been beautiful once. I could see that even in its broken state. The way the glass had been shaped to catch and hold light, to transform it into something precious. Now it was just sharp edges and scattered pieces, dangerous to touch but impossible to ignore. Like everything else in that room. They were taking longer than I expected, photographing every angle, measuring distances, collecting fragments in small plastic bags, treating my confusion like evidence, my forgetfulness like a clue. Maybe it was. The music had stopped. I hadn't noticed when, but the silence felt different now, complete. Even the curtains seemed to hang more still, as if the breeze had finally exhausted itself, as if whatever had been trying to escape through that open window had finally succeeded. I wanted to leave, to walk back out the way I had come and pretend I had never found the key, never opened the door, never stepped into someone else's chaos. But my feet felt rooted to the spot, as if the scattered papers were quicksand and any movement might pull me deeper. One of them asked if I was all right, if I needed to sit down, maybe get some air. The concern in their voice made me realize I must have looked as lost as I felt, as guilty as I was beginning to feel, even though I couldn't name what I might be guilty of. The chair by the window was still warm when I touched it, as if someone had been sitting there recently, watching, waiting. The cushion held the faint impression of a body, the fabric slightly compressed in the shape of someone who had spent long hours in that spot. Someone who might have seen me coming. The lavender scent was strongest there, clinging to the upholstery like a memory that refused to fade. I breathed it in despite myself, and for a moment the confusion lifted. For just a moment I remembered why I had come. But then someone asked another question, and the moment shattered like glass, like the cardinal, like everything else that had once been whole and beautiful and safe. I touched the cut on my finger again, still fresh, still bleeding just a little, still real in a way that nothing else in that room seemed to be. The window was still open, the curtains still moving, though barely, and somewhere carried on air that tasted of lavender and secrets. I could almost hear the echo of my own voice saying things I couldn't quite remember, promising things I wasn't sure I had kept, making excuses for things I wasn't ready to confess. The paper cut stings when I touch it, even now, even when I'm far from that room with its scattered evidence and broken glass and questions that have no good answers. The scar is thin, barely visible, but I can feel it there like a reminder. Like a confession I'm not ready to make. The lavender comes and goes, phantom and real, carrying me back to that moment when everything changed. When I stopped being someone who noticed things and became someone who claimed not to notice them. When I learned the difference between the two. The window is still open somewhere, the curtains still moving, the papers still scattered in patterns that might mean everything or nothing, depending on how carefully you look. Depending on how much you're willing to remember. Story 4. The clock's tick faltered, overlapping with my heartbeat, creating a rhythm that didn't belong. The floor creaked in a sequence I hadn't heard before, each step echoing half a beat too late. The air in the room felt thick, carrying a scent of misplaced familiarity. Patterns on the wallpaper danced at the corner of my eye, just slightly but persistently out of sync. As I turned to leave, the door handle turned back, an imitation of my gesture that I never initiated. I knew exactly what had happened that night. The certainty came to me like a photograph developing in solution, sharp and undeniable. She had been planning it for weeks, maybe months. The pills were already in her system when I arrived, the bottle empty on the nightstand, her breathing shallow but steady. I had found her in time. That was the story I told myself, the story I told the investigators, the story that made sense of everything that followed. The house had been silent except for the sound of her labored breathing. I remember checking her pulse, feeling the weak flutter against my fingertips, then calling for help. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their voices cutting through the stillness as they worked to stabilize her. She survived, she recovered, and she thanked me for saving her life. For months afterward, I carried that night with me like a badge of honor. I had been in the right place at the right time. I had acted quickly, decisively. The alternative was too terrible to consider. When people asked about it, I told them the same story. The empty pill bottle, the shallow breathing, the timely intervention. It felt true every time I said it. But memories are strange things. They shift and settle like sediment in still water, and sometimes what rises to the surface isn't what you expected to find. The first crack appeared during a conversation with her sister. We were sitting in a coffee shop, the kind of place where conversations happen in hushed tones and everyone pretends not to listen. Her sister was thanking me again, her voice thick with gratitude, when she mentioned something that stopped me cold. "She was so lucky you came by early that night," she said, stirring sugar into her cup. "If you had stuck to your usual time, it might have been too late." I nodded, but something twisted in my stomach. My usual time. The words echoed strangely because I couldn't remember having a usual time. I had gone to see her that night on impulse, hadn't I? A spontaneous decision to check in to see how she was doing. But her sister spoke as if my visits followed a pattern, as if there was something routine about my presence in her life. I tried to remember the weeks leading up to that night, but the details felt slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Had I been visiting regularly? The thought unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite name. That night I found myself standing in my kitchen, staring at the calendar on the refrigerator. There were no appointments marked, no reminders of visits or plans, but there were gaps in my memory, spaces of time that felt oddly empty. I told myself it didn't matter. The important thing was that I had been there when she needed me. But the doubt had taken root. The second crack came when I returned to her house for the first time since that night. She had invited me for dinner, a gesture of gratitude that felt both touching and strange. As I walked through the familiar rooms, something felt different, not just because of what had happened, but because of how well I seemed to know the space. I found myself reaching for light switches without looking, navigating around furniture in the dim hallway as if I had done it countless times before. In the kitchen, I opened the right cabinet on the first try when she asked me to grab plates. She laughed and said I knew her house better than she did, but her laughter had an edge to it that made me look at her more carefully. "How often was I here before?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. She paused in the middle of chopping vegetables, the knife suspended in midair. "You don't remember." The question hung between us like smoke. I wanted to say yes, of course I remembered, but the truth was that my memories of the time before that night felt fragmented, incomplete. I remembered moments, conversations, shared meals, quiet evenings, but they existed in isolation, disconnected from any sense of chronology or frequency. "Things have been a bit fuzzy lately," I said finally. She set down the knife and turned to face me fully. There was something in her expression that I couldn't read, a mixture of concern and something else. Wariness, maybe, or fear. "You were here almost every day," she said quietly, "for months." The words hit me like a physical blow. Every day, for months. How could I have forgotten something so significant? I searched my memory desperately, looking for evidence of this routine, this pattern of visits that had apparently defined my life for so long. But there were only fragments, disconnected pieces that refused to form a coherent whole. "I was helping you through a difficult time," I said, more to myself than to her. "Yes," she agreed, but her voice was careful, measured. "You were very helpful." We finished preparing dinner in relative silence, but I could feel her watching me, studying my face as if she were trying to solve a puzzle. When we sat down to eat, the conversation felt forced, artificial. We were both performing roles that no longer fit quite right. That night I lay in bed replaying our conversation, trying to understand why it felt so wrong. She had thanked me for saving her life, but there had been something hollow about her gratitude, as if she were reading from a script. And my own responses felt equally rehearsed, as if I were playing a part I had memorized but no longer fully understood. I began to pay attention to things I had previously overlooked. The way she tensed slightly when I knocked on her door, the careful way she spoke around me as if she were afraid of saying the wrong thing, the fact that she never invited me to stay long, always finding reasons for me to leave after an hour or two. These weren't the behaviors of someone who was grateful to their rescuer. They were the behaviors of someone who was afraid. The realization came to me gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape I thought I knew. I began to question not just my memories of that night, but my understanding of everything that had led up to it. If I had been visiting her every day for months, what had those visits really been about? What kind of help had I been providing? I started paying attention to other people's reactions when her name came up in conversation. There were glances exchanged, conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered a room. Her friends seemed to know something I didn't, or perhaps something I had forgotten. One evening I found myself standing outside her house, trying to remember how I had ended up there. I had no memory of deciding to visit, no recollection of walking the familiar route from my place to hers. It was as if I had simply materialized on her doorstep, drawn by some compulsion I didn't understand. I didn't knock. Instead, I walked around to the side of the house where a window looked into her living room. She was sitting on the couch, reading a book, and for a moment she looked peaceful, relaxed in a way I rarely saw when I was with her. Then she glanced toward the window, and her face changed. Even through the glass, I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew I was there. She had been expecting me. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. How long had I been standing there? How many other times had I done this without remembering? The thought made me sick. That night I searched my house for clues about the person I was becoming, or perhaps had always been. In a drawer I rarely opened, I found a notebook filled with observations about her daily routine. What time she left for work, when she returned, which lights she turned on in which order. The notes were written in my handwriting, but I had no memory of making them. On another page, I found detailed descriptions of her emotional state on various occasions, her mood when she answered the door, the way she reacted to different topics of conversation, the subtle signs that indicated when she was becoming uncomfortable or anxious. It read like a manual for manipulation, a guide for getting close to someone who didn't want you there. The notebook fell from my hands as if it were burning. This wasn't the record of someone who was helping a friend through a difficult time. This was the record of someone who was stalking her. But if that was true, then what had really happened that night? Had I found her after an overdose, or had I been there for some other reason? Had I saved her life, or had I been the reason she wanted to end it? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, spreading through every memory I had of our relationship. Every conversation took on new meaning when viewed through this lens. Every gesture of gratitude felt like a performance designed to keep me calm, to prevent me from doing something worse. I began to understand why my memories of that time were so fragmented. The mind has ways of protecting itself from truths too terrible to bear. It edits out the parts that don't fit the story we need to tell ourselves in order to keep functioning. But now that the editing was failing, now that the real memories were beginning to surface, I could see the pattern clearly. I hadn't been helping her, I had been terrorizing her. My daily visits hadn't been acts of kindness, but invasions. My presence in her life hadn't been welcome, but endured out of fear. And that night, when I found her unconscious, when I called for help and stayed with her until the paramedics arrived, I hadn't been saving her life. I had been covering my tracks. The pill bottle on the nightstand, the shallow breathing, the timely intervention. All of it was true, but the truth was more complex than I had allowed myself to remember. She had taken those pills because of me, because I had made her life unbearable, because she saw no other way to escape the prison I had created around her. And when I found her, when I realized what she had done, I hadn't called for help out of love or concern. I had called because I couldn't bear the thought of being responsible for her death, because I needed her to survive so that I could continue to tell myself I was the hero of this story. The gratitude she had shown me afterward, the thanks and the careful smiles, weren't genuine appreciation. They were a survival strategy. She had learned that it was safer to play along with my delusion than to confront me with the truth. Safer to let me believe I had saved her than to remind me of what I had really done. But now I remembered, not everything, but enough. Enough to understand that the person I thought I was and the person I actually was were two different people entirely. The hero and the villain had been living in the same body, and I had been so committed to the hero's story that I had edited out everything that contradicted it. Standing in my kitchen, holding that notebook full of surveillance notes, I finally understood why she looked at me with such careful fear, why her friends exchanged glances when my name came up, why her sister had spoken of my visits as if they followed a pattern I couldn't remember. I was the threat she had been trying to escape. I was the reason she had felt desperate enough to swallow a bottle of pills. And I was the reason she continued to live in fear, even now, even after surviving. The clock on my wall ticked steadily, but it sounded different now. Less like the marking of time and more like a countdown to what I wasn't sure. But I could feel something building, some inevitable conclusion that I was moving toward whether I wanted to or not. I thought about calling her, about trying to apologize or explain. But what could I say? How do you apologize for becoming someone's nightmare? How do you explain behavior that you yourself don't fully understand? Instead, I found myself putting on my jacket, checking my pockets for keys. My feet seemed to know where they wanted to go, even as my mind struggled to catch up. The route to her house was so familiar that I could walk it without thinking, and that familiarity now felt sinister rather than comforting. As I walked through the quiet streets, I wondered how many other nights I had made this same journey, how many times I had stood outside her house, watching and waiting. How many times she had seen my shadow at her window and felt her heart race with terror. The worst part wasn't that I had done these things. The worst part was that even now, even knowing what I knew, I couldn't seem to stop myself from doing them again. The compulsion was stronger than my understanding, older than my guilt. I was almost to her street when I finally stopped walking. Standing under a streetlight, I tried to understand what I was planning to do when I got there. Knock on her door, peer through her windows, force my way inside. The truth was I didn't know, and that not knowing was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. If I couldn't trust my own memories, if I couldn't rely on my own perception of events, then how could I predict what I might do next? I turned around and walked home, but the victory felt hollow. Tomorrow night or the night after, I might not be strong enough to turn back. The pattern that had defined our relationship was still there, still pulling at me like gravity. And she was still living in fear, still waiting for the night when I might finally cross whatever line I had been approaching all along. The notebook was still on my kitchen table when I got home, open to a page covered with observations about her daily routine. I stared at my own handwriting, at the careful documentation of her life, and realized that I still didn't know the full extent of what I had done. There might be other notebooks, other records, other evidence of behavior I couldn't remember. But perhaps not remembering was its own kind of mercy. Perhaps the mind's ability to edit out the worst parts of ourselves was the only thing that made it possible to keep living. Without that editing, without the comfortable delusions that allowed us to see ourselves as heroes rather than villains, maybe we would all be reaching for bottles of pills. I closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer, but I didn't throw it away. Some part of me knew that I might need it again, might need to remind myself of who I really was the next time I started believing my own story about being her savior. The clock on the wall continued its steady ticking, marking time that felt both endless and running out. Somewhere across town, she was probably lying awake, listening to the sounds of the night, wondering if tonight would be the night I finally stopped turning back. And the terrible truth was, I didn't know either. Story 5. The rustling of leaves was the song of the morning, a gentle melody carried by the cool breeze filtering through the open window. The freshly painted walls filled the room with a hint of lavender, whispering of renewal. Yet it was the motionless shadow beneath the drawn curtain that pulled at the edges of my perception, a silent interruption in the soft choreography of dawn. As the first rays of sun began to stretch across the floor, the shadow seemed to deepen, a silent sentinel that defied explanation. The air, once crisp, now felt heavy, as if anticipation itself had drawn a breath and held it. The coffee cup on the nightstand held yesterday's dregs, a ring of brown residue marking the porcelain like a stain on memory itself. I had set it there before sleep, I was certain of this, yet the handle pointed toward the window now when I distinctly recalled placing it facing the door. Such small inconsistencies had begun to accumulate in my mind like dust in forgotten corners. The ceramic felt cold beneath my fingertips, colder than the morning air should have allowed, as if it had been sitting untouched for far longer than a single night. The photograph on the dresser caught the early light, its silver frame reflecting a distorted version of the room back at me. 3 faces smiled from within the glass, frozen in a moment of happiness that felt both familiar and foreign. The woman in the center bore my features, yet something in her expression seemed different from what I remembered feeling that day. Her eyes held a knowledge that I could not recall possessing, a secret that the camera had somehow captured but my memory had misplaced. The floorboards beneath my feet sang their wooden song as I moved toward the window, each creak a note in a melody I had learned by heart over countless mornings. Yet today the third board from the wall remained silent, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I pressed my weight against it deliberately, testing its voice, but it offered only mute resistance. The silence felt wrong, like a missing word in a familiar prayer. The curtain fabric held the scent of fabric softener and something else, something metallic that reminded me of rain on pavement. When I pulled it aside, the shadow that had troubled me dissolved into nothing more than the play of light and furniture, yet the unease remained. Outside, the garden stretched in neat rows, each plant in its designated place except for the roses by the gate. They had been white yesterday, I was certain, but now they bloomed in deep crimson, as if they had drunk something richer than water in the night. The telephone on the kitchen counter displayed 3 missed calls, all from the same number that I recognized but could not quite place. The digits swam in my vision like numbers in a dream, familiar yet elusive. I had turned the ringer off before bed, a habit born from too many sleepless nights, yet I could swear I remembered hearing it ring sometime in the small hours. The sound had woven itself into my dreams, becoming the cry of a bird or the whistle of wind, but now I wondered if it had been real after all. The newspaper lay folded on the front step, its headlines speaking of distant troubles and local celebrations. But there in the corner of the community section was a photograph that made my breath catch, The same silver frame, the same three smiling faces, but the caption below spoke of an anniversary that had passed weeks ago. My hands trembled as I read the words that described an event I could not remember attending, a celebration that felt both mine and not mine simultaneously. The kitchen sink held a single glass, water-stained and sitting in a puddle of its own making. I did not remember using it, yet my lips recalled the taste of water drunk in darkness, the cool relief of liquid against a throat raw from crying. But I had not been crying, had I? My cheeks felt tight, as if salt had dried there, though I could not remember shedding tears. The mirror above the sink reflected eyes that looked haunted, pupils dilated despite the growing light. The medication bottle on the counter rattled with pills I could not name, prescribed by a doctor whose face remained frustratingly blank in my memory. The label bore my name, but the dosage instructions were written in handwriting that looked like mine yet felt foreign. 3 times daily it read, yet I could only remember taking them once. The bottle felt lighter than it should have, as if more pills had vanished than I had consumed. The journal in the bedroom drawer lay open to a page covered in my own script, but the words seemed to belong to someone else. They spoke of conversations I could not recall having, of decisions I did not remember making, of fears that felt both intimate and alien. The ink was fresh, the indentations deep, suggesting recent writing, yet I had no memory of opening the book. The final entry was dated yesterday, but ended mid-sentence, the pen lying beside it as if I had been interrupted by something urgent. The closet door stood slightly ajar, revealing clothes that hung like empty shells of a life I was beginning to question. The blue dress in the front bore a stain on the sleeve, dark and irregular, that I could not account for. It had been clean when I last wore it, I was certain, yet now it bore this mark like evidence of some forgotten encounter. The fabric smelled faintly of perfume I did not recognize, sweet and cloying in a way that made my stomach turn. The car keys on the hall table were warm to the touch, as if recently used, though I had no memory of leaving the house. The keychain bore a small dent that had not been there before, and tiny scratches marked the metal as if they had been dropped on pavement. My car sat in the driveway exactly where I had left it, yet the odometer showed miles that I could not account for, journeys taken in darkness that my conscious mind had somehow erased. The answering machine blinked with messages I was afraid to hear, red light pulsing like a heartbeat in the dim hallway. When I finally pressed play, my own voice spoke back to me, making appointments I did not remember scheduling, confirming meetings that felt like fiction. The woman on the recording sounded confident, purposeful, nothing like the confused person I felt myself to be in this strange morning light. The bathroom mirror revealed a face I recognized but could not quite claim. A small bandage adorned my temple, covering what felt like a tender spot I had no memory of injuring. When I peeled it back, the skin beneath was bruised in shades of purple and yellow that spoke of days of healing I could not remember experiencing. The wound was clean, professionally tended, yet I had no recollection of seeking medical attention. The bed sheets, when I returned to examine them, were tucked with military precision on one side while the other remained rumpled from my sleep. The pillow beside mine bore the impression of another head, the fabric still holding the scent of unfamiliar shampoo. Yet I lived alone, had always lived alone, or so I believed. The evidence before my eyes suggested otherwise, painting a picture of a life shared with someone my memory had somehow erased. The shadow beneath the curtain had returned, or perhaps it had never truly left. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, growing and shrinking with each beat of my heart. As I watched, transfixed, it began to take shape, forming the outline of a figure that felt both threatening and protective. The morning light should have banished such illusions, yet this darkness persisted, patient and eternal, waiting for something I could not name. The house around me hummed with secrets I had hidden from myself, each object a witness to events my mind refused to acknowledge. The coffee cup, the photograph, the stained dress, the mysterious miles, the healing wound, all pieces of a puzzle that my consciousness had scattered like leaves in an autumn wind. I stood at the center of my own life, a stranger in familiar surroundings, wondering what truths lay buried beneath the careful construction of my daily routine. The rustling of leaves continued outside, unchanged and eternal, but now it sounded less like music and more like whispers, carrying messages in a language I had forgotten how to speak. The shadow waited, patient and knowing, as if it held the key to questions I was not yet brave enough to ask. The morning stretched ahead, full of ordinary moments that might reveal extraordinary secrets, if only I had the courage to look beyond the comfortable lies I had apparently been telling myself. Story 6. The night shift. The control panel displayed all systems operational upon inspection. Surveillance feeds cycled through their designated views with routine precision, capturing empty corridors and unlit rooms. A half-eaten meal occupied the console's edge, utensils arranged symmetrically beside the plate. The clock on the wall ticked in measured intervals, keeping time with relentless accuracy. The air conditioning maintained a steady hum, ensuring a constant environment. All documents remained in their designated trays. Yet the system log registered a single command executed at an undocumented hour. I stared at that entry for what felt like forever, my coffee growing cold in my hands. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting their familiar harsh glow across the security office where I'd worked for 3 years. Everything appeared normal, identical to countless other shifts I'd pulled in this building. But that single line of code glowed on the screen like an accusation. The building housed offices for various companies, nothing particularly interesting or valuable. Insurance adjusters, accounting firms, a small law practice. The kind of place where the most exciting security incident might be someone forgetting their key card or working too late. I'd taken this job because it was quiet, predictable. After my discharge, I needed predictable. But predictable didn't include unauthorized system commands executed while the previous guard was supposedly alone on duty. I scrolled through the digital logs searching for any explanation. The timestamp showed the command had been entered during the overnight shift when my colleague worked alone. He'd been doing this job longer than anyone, reliable as sunrise. The kind of guy who brought the same sandwich every night, read the same type of paperback thriller, and never deviated from his rounds. The command itself was simple, a temporary override of the 4th floor access restrictions. Nothing dramatic, just a brief suspension of the card reader requirements for one specific hallway. The system showed it had been reversed within a short span, everything returning to normal protocols. I picked up the phone to call him, then hesitated. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe maintenance had requested access and he'd simply forgotten to log it properly. Maybe I was overthinking what amounted to a minor paperwork error. The building felt different that morning as I walked my final rounds before shift change. The same beige corridors, the same industrial carpeting, the same motivational posters that someone had hung years ago and never updated. But my footsteps seemed to echo differently, and I found myself pausing at the 4th floor entrance. The hallway beyond the restricted door looked identical to every other hallway in the building. Fluorescent strips illuminated a path lined with office doors, each bearing small plaques with company names and suite numbers. Nothing appeared disturbed or out of place. Yet something made me linger, studying the space as if it might reveal its secrets. When my replacement arrived, I mentioned the log entry casually. He shrugged, suggesting I ask the night guard directly. Simple enough. But when I tried calling later that day, the phone went straight to voicemail. His gravelly voice recited a standard message, asking callers to leave their name and number. Sleep didn't come easily that afternoon. I kept thinking about that single line in the system log, about the precision with which someone had granted themselves access and then covered their tracks. The more I considered it, the more deliberate it seemed. The next evening I arrived early, hoping to catch the night guard before he started his shift. The parking lot held only a few scattered vehicles, and I recognized his old sedan in its usual spot near the service entrance. But when I checked the security office, I found it empty except for a note explaining he'd called in sick. I settled into my chair, pulling up the previous night's logs. Everything appeared routine except for one detail that made my skin crawl. The sick call had been logged by the building manager, but the timestamp showed it had been received after the night guard's shift had already begun. According to the entry, he'd called in sick while he was supposedly already at work. The building felt heavier that night, shadows seeming darker despite the unchanged lighting. I found myself checking the monitors more frequently, studying each camera feed for anything unusual. The fourth floor remained empty, its restricted hallway visible through the security camera mounted at the entrance. Around what I estimated to be the middle of my shift, I decided to walk that hallway myself. Using my master access, I pushed through the door and stepped into the corridor. The air felt staler here, carrying a faint chemical smell that reminded me of cleaning supplies mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Most of the offices were dark, their occupants long gone for the day. But as I walked slowly down the hallway, I noticed that one door stood slightly ajar. The nameplate read Consulting Services with a suite number, nothing more descriptive than that. I pushed the door open carefully, my hand instinctively moving to the flashlight on my belt. The office beyond was small and sparsely furnished. A desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, everything neat and professional, except for the papers scattered across the desk surface and a coffee mug that still held liquid. The papers appeared to be financial documents, columns of numbers and account information that meant nothing to me. But what caught my attention was a photograph tucked beneath one of the spreadsheets. It showed a woman I didn't recognize, smiling at the camera in what looked like a professional headshot. Someone had written numbers across the bottom margin in red ink. I heard footsteps in the hallway behind me and quickly stepped back from the desk. A man appeared in the doorway, tall and thin, with graying hair and tired eyes. He looked surprised to see me, then offered a sheepish smile. "Working late," he said, as if that explained everything. "Didn't realize security made rounds up here." I explained about the open door, keeping my tone casual and professional. He nodded, thanking me for checking, and moved to his desk to gather the scattered papers. His movements were quick and efficient, and I noticed he palmed the photograph as he straightened the documents. "Big project," he said, noticing my glance at the papers. "Accounting can be tedious, but someone has to keep track of where the money goes." I left him to his work, but the encounter stayed with me as I completed my rounds. Something about his demeanor felt rehearsed, as if he'd been prepared for exactly this type of interruption. And the photograph bothered me, though I couldn't articulate why. The next few shifts passed without incident. The night guard returned to work, apologizing for his absence and explaining he'd had a stomach bug. He seemed his usual self, making his rounds with mechanical precision and settling into his routine of sandwich and paperback thriller. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. I started paying closer attention to the fourth floor, noting which offices showed lights during evening hours and which cars remained in the parking lot after normal business hours. The consulting services office frequently showed activity well into the night. I began keeping my own informal log, noting observations that seemed potentially relevant. The thin man with graying hair worked late at least 3 nights per week. He always parked in the same spot, always used the service entrance, and always seemed to be carrying a briefcase that looked heavier than it should. Other details accumulated gradually. The cleaning crew mentioned that his office generated more trash than seemed normal for a single occupant. The building manager commented that the consulting services company paid their rent in cash, which was unusual but not unheard of. Small things that individually meant nothing but collectively painted a picture I didn't like. I tried researching the consulting services company online but found almost nothing. A basic website with generic language about financial services and business optimization. No employee photos, no detailed service descriptions, no client testimonials. The kind of web presence designed to exist without revealing anything meaningful. The breakthrough came when I discovered that the night guard had been making unauthorized copies of key cards. The system tracked every card duplication, and I found records of multiple copies being made for the fourth floor restricted access. When confronted, he claimed the building manager had requested them for maintenance purposes. But when I checked with the building manager, he had no record of requesting additional key cards. More concerning, he mentioned that the consulting services company had specifically requested that their hallway be designated as restricted access when they'd signed their lease. They'd paid extra for the enhanced security measures. I started staying after my shifts, positioning myself where I could observe the fourth floor entrance without being seen. The thin man's routine became familiar. Arrival through the service entrance, direct path to his office, minimal interaction with anyone else in the building, but occasionally other people joined him. Always different individuals, always carrying similar heavy briefcases, always leaving within a few hours of arriving. The photograph I'd glimpsed in his office haunted my thoughts. Something about the woman's face seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen her. I found myself studying news websites and social media, searching for that same smile and those same eyes. When I finally found her, the discovery hit me like ice water. She'd been reported missing several months earlier, last seen leaving her job at a financial planning firm. The news articles described her as dedicated and trustworthy, someone who'd never simply disappeared without explanation. The investigation had apparently stalled due to lack of evidence. I printed the news article and stared at her photograph for a long time. The numbers written across the bottom of the photo I'd seen suddenly took on a more sinister significance. They might have been account numbers or codes, but they might also have been something else entirely. The weight of what I might be uncovering pressed down on me as I sat in the empty security office. If my suspicions were correct, I was dealing with something far more serious than unauthorized access or minor policy violations. But I also realized how little concrete evidence I actually possessed. Suspicious behavior and circumstantial observations wouldn't be enough to convince anyone that a crime had been committed. I needed more information, but obtaining it would require risks I wasn't sure I was prepared to take. The building felt different now, less like a workplace and more like a crime scene waiting to be discovered. Every shadow seemed to hide secrets, and every routine interaction carried the potential for danger. The night guard's behavior became increasingly nervous over the following weeks. He'd started arriving early and staying late, overlapping with my shifts in ways that felt deliberate. Our conversations grew stilted and careful, both of us aware that something unspoken hung between us. I caught him reviewing the security footage one evening, scrolling through recorded feeds with intense concentration. When he noticed me watching, he quickly closed the program and mumbled something about checking for maintenance issues. But I'd seen enough to know he was reviewing footage from the fourth floor, focusing on the time periods when the consulting services office showed activity. The realization that he might be as concerned as I was provided little comfort. If anything, it suggested that whatever was happening in that office was serious enough to worry someone who'd been complicit in providing access. I made the decision to document everything I could before taking any further action. Using my access to the security system, I began copying relevant footage and logs, building a comprehensive record of the suspicious activities I'd observed. The process was slow and careful, as I couldn't risk alerting anyone to my investigation. The evidence painted a disturbing picture. The consulting services office received visitors at irregular hours, always individuals who avoided the main entrance and parking areas visible to street traffic. The financial documents I'd glimpsed suggested transactions involving substantial amounts of money, but the context remained unclear. Most troubling was the growing collection of photographs I discovered during one late-night investigation of the office. The thin man had been careless one evening, leaving his filing cabinet unlocked when he'd stepped out briefly. Inside, I found a folder containing dozens of professional headshots, each marked with numbers and dates in the same red ink I'd seen before. I recognized several faces from missing person reports I'd found online. Professional women, all working in financial services or related fields, all reported missing over the past 2 years. The pattern was unmistakable, but its implications were almost too horrific to contemplate. My hands shook as I photographed the contents of the folder with my phone, working quickly to document everything before the thin man returned. The weight of what I was uncovering felt crushing, and I struggled to maintain my composure as I carefully returned everything to its original position. The night guard was waiting for me when I returned to the security office, his face pale and drawn. He'd been watching the monitors and had seen me enter the restricted hallway. For a long moment, we stared at each other in silence, both understanding that we'd reached a point where pretense was no longer possible. "You don't know what you're getting involved in," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some things are better left alone." I asked him directly what was happening in the consulting services office, but he just shook his head and gathered his belongings. Before leaving, he turned back to me with an expression I'd never seen before, fear mixed with something that might have been regret. "I needed the money," he said. "My wife's medical bills, they were drowning us. It seemed harmless at first, just looking the other way, making sure certain activities weren't recorded. But it's not harmless, and now I don't know how to stop it." He left me alone with that confession and the weight of decisions I wasn't prepared to make. The evidence I'd gathered pointed towards something terrible, but I also understood that I was dealing with people who'd already demonstrated their willingness to make problems disappear. The building felt like a trap as I completed my remaining rounds that night. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow potentially threatening. I found myself checking the exits and planning escape routes, professional paranoia mixing with very personal fear. By morning, I'd made my decision. The evidence needed to be turned over to proper authorities, regardless of the personal risk. But when I arrived for my next shift, I discovered that the consulting services office had been emptied overnight. The furniture remained, but every document, every computer, every trace of the activities I'd witnessed had vanished. The thin man never returned. According to the building manager, the consulting services company had terminated their lease effective immediately, citing business restructuring as their reason for relocating. The rent had been paid in full, and they'd left no forwarding address. I submitted my evidence to the police, but without the physical documents and with the primary suspects having disappeared, the investigation struggled to gain momentum. The missing women remained missing, their cases still open but no closer to resolution. The night guard quit shortly after, claiming health issues prevented him from continuing his employment. I never saw him again, though I sometimes wondered whether his wife's medical bills had been resolved and whether he'd found peace with the choices he'd made. I transferred to a different building, unable to continue working in a place that held so many unanswered questions, but the case never left my thoughts completely. Sometimes I'd find myself researching similar missing person cases, looking for patterns that might indicate the operation had simply moved to a different location. The truth remains elusive, hidden behind circumstantial evidence and the testimony of witnesses who have chosen silence over justice. I know what I saw, what I documented, what I discovered in that filing cabinet, but knowing and proving are different things, and some crimes are designed to exist in the spaces between certainty and doubt. The system logs from that building still show a single unauthorized command executed during an undocumented hour. It's a small detail in a larger story, but it represents the moment when routine became investigation, when normal became sinister, when I learned that sometimes the most horrific crimes hide behind the most mundane facades. I still work security, still walk empty corridors and monitor surveillance feeds. But now I pay attention to the details that don't quite fit, the patterns that seem too convenient, the explanations that answer everything except the questions that matter most. Because somewhere out there, in another building with another consulting services office, someone else might be noticing that single line in a system log that shouldn't exist. And maybe, if they're braver than I was, they'll find a way to do something about it before more photographs get added to more folders, before more families lose someone they'll never see again. The case remains open, officially unsolved, filed away in a drawer somewhere with all the other mysteries that resist easy answers. But I remember every detail, every face in those photographs, every moment when I could have acted differently or moved faster or been more courageous in pursuing justice. That's the burden of being a witness to something terrible, living with the knowledge that evil exists in ordinary places, conducted by ordinary people, hidden behind ordinary explanations that satisfy everyone except those who have seen behind the facade. The control panel still displays all systems operational. The surveillance feeds still cycle through their designated views. And somewhere in another building in another place, another security guard might be staring at a single line in a system log, wondering whether they have the courage to investigate what it might mean. Story 7. Every Friday, a light down the street flickers, a steady staccato of 3 flashes, then darkness, as if signaling the end of the week. It barely caught my attention, at first a minor annoyance, until I realized the flickers started to shift. A pause lingered where none had been, a missing flash one week, an extra the next. Last night I counted 4 rapid bursts. It seemed insignificant, just a bulb nearing its end. Yet this morning the light was steady, without a flicker. but I can't help but feel a chill, as if something else has taken its place. The kitchen window frames that light perfectly. I've stood here countless mornings, coffee mug warming my palms, watching the world wake up through this same pane of glass. The window sits at just the right height, just the right angle. I never questioned why I always gravitated toward this spot until recently. The glass bears a small crack in the lower left corner, a hairline fracture that catches the morning sun and splits it into tiny rainbows. I used to find it charming. Now it feels like a flaw that lets something unwanted seep through. My notebook rests on the counter beside the coffee maker, its pages filled with careful observations. When did I start keeping track? The entries begin innocuously enough. Light flickered at usual time. Same pattern as last week. But as I flip through the pages, my handwriting grows more urgent, the observations more detailed, times recorded to the minute, weather conditions noted, even the number of cars that passed during each sequence. The most recent entry, written in shaky letters, simply reads, "The pattern knows I'm watching." The coffee maker gurgles its familiar morning song, but today the sound carries an undertone I've never noticed before. A subtle wheeze between the bubbles, like labored breathing. I've had this machine for years. It was a housewarming gift from someone whose face I can barely recall now. The digital display blinks 6:47 a.m. in green numbers that seem too bright in the dim kitchen. I realize I've been standing here for nearly 20 minutes, staring at that light, waiting for it to misbehave again. The refrigerator hums join the coffee maker's chorus, creating a domestic symphony I once found comforting. But underneath the familiar drone, there's something else, a rhythm that matches the old pattern of the street light. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause. My heart begins to mirror the cadence, and I wonder if I'm losing my grip on reality or finally understanding something that was always there. The telephone on the wall hasn't rung in days. Its black cord coils like a sleeping snake, and the receiver bears the patina of countless conversations I can no longer remember clearly. There was a time when calls came regularly, friends checking in, work colleagues discussing projects, automated reminders about appointments. Now the silence stretches so long I sometimes pick up the receiver just to hear the dial tone, proof that the line still connects to the outside world. My reflection in the toaster's chrome surface looks distorted, elongated, like a funhouse mirror version of myself. The person staring back has hollow eyes and sharp angles where soft curves should be. I can't remember the last time I looked in a proper mirror. The bathroom mirror developed a habit of fogging up even without hot water running, obscuring my image in ways that feel intentional rather than accidental. The kitchen table holds evidence of my growing obsession, printed maps of the neighborhood with the street light marked in red ink, sketches of the light fixture drawn from memory, and a growing stack of research about electrical patterns and their potential meanings. The wood grain beneath the papers swirls in patterns that remind me of fingerprints, as if the table itself has been touched by something seeking identification. My cereal bowl sits empty beside the notebook, milk residue forming a thin film around the edges. I don't remember finishing breakfast, though the spoon rests at the precise angle someone would place it after the last bite. The cereal box, some generic brand I must have grabbed without thinking, bears a cheerful mascot whose smile seems forced, painted on by someone who understood the necessity of appearing normal. The kitchen clock ticks with mechanical precision, but I've begun to suspect it runs slow. Not dramatically, just enough to make me late for things that used to matter. Appointments I thought I had time for slip past. Deadlines creep up with surprising speed. Yet when I check the time against my phone, they always match perfectly, leaving me to question whether time itself has become unreliable or if my perception has shifted in ways I'm reluctant to acknowledge. The dish towel hanging from the oven handle bears a pattern of small blue flowers that seem to shift position when I'm not looking directly at them. I know this sounds impossible, but I've tested it repeatedly. A flower cluster near the bottom left appears higher when I glance away and back again. The fabric shows no signs of stretching or distortion, just a subtle rearrangement that makes me doubt my own memory. My house slippers have worn thin at the heels from countless trips to this window. The path from bedroom to kitchen has become so familiar I could navigate it blindfolded, yet lately I find myself taking wrong turns in my own home. The hallway seems longer some mornings, the doorways positioned differently than I remember. I tell myself it's fatigue, but the wrongness persists even after a full night's sleep. The newspaper still arrives each morning, though I can't recall subscribing to it. The delivery person remains invisible. I never see them approach or leave, only discover the paper folded neatly on the front step. The headlines blur together in my memory, but the local news section always includes a brief mention of electrical maintenance in the neighborhood, updates that seem designed to explain away any unusual lighting patterns. The mailbox key on my keychain has developed a green patina that wasn't there before. I notice it each time I sort through the ring, searching for the house key that sometimes seems to hide among its companions. The mail itself has dwindled to advertisements and official-looking envelopes I'm afraid to open. Bills can wait. Explanations for my recent behavior cannot be so easily deferred. My neighbor's cat used to visit the yard regularly, a gray tabby with white paws who would sit beneath the bird feeder and watch the sparrows with patient intensity. I haven't seen the cat in weeks, though I sometimes find paw prints in the soil around the garden. The prints appear too large for the tabby, pressed too deep into the earth, as if made by something heavier masquerading as something familiar and harmless. The bird feeder hangs empty now. I forgot to refill it, or perhaps I stopped deliberately. The birds that once provided morning entertainment have moved on to more reliable sources of sustenance. Their absence creates a silence that allows other sounds to emerge: the subtle electrical hum from the street light, the whisper of wind through power lines, the distant conversation of voices I can never quite locate. The garden hose coils beside the back door like evidence of abandoned intentions. I meant to water the plants, to maintain the small patch of normalcy I'd cultivated in the backyard. Instead, the flowers have wilted into brown sculptures of their former selves, creating a landscape that matches my internal state better than the cheerful blooms ever did. The basement door remains locked, though I don't remember securing it. The key should be on my ring with the others, but it's missing. Sometimes I hear sounds from below, not footsteps exactly, but a rhythmic tapping that matches the old pattern of the street light. I tell myself it's the water heater or settling foundation, explanations that satisfy the rational part of my mind while leaving the primitive brain stem unconvinced. The living room curtains stay drawn now. Natural light feels too revealing, too honest for the thoughts that occupy my days. The fabric filters the world into muted tones that seem more appropriate for the uncertainty I'm experiencing. When I do peek outside, the neighborhood looks subtly different: houses positioned at slightly wrong angles, trees fuller or barer than they should be for the season. The television remote has disappeared, leaving me with whatever channel was last selected. The programming runs in loops. I can't quite track news segments that repeat with minor variations, weather reports that predict conditions for places I don't recognize, advertisements for products that solve problems I didn't know existed. The volume control on the set itself no longer responds to touch. My car keys hang on their designated hook, but the car itself has developed quirks that concern me. The radio picks up stations that shouldn't reach this area, playing music from decades I can't identify. The odometer seems to gain miles even when the car sits unused in the driveway. The rearview mirror reflects a version of the street that includes details I know aren't there: a fire hydrant painted yellow instead of red, a stop sign where none should exist. The medicine cabinet in the bathroom contains bottles I don't remember purchasing. The labels bear my name and address, but the prescriptions are for conditions I've never been diagnosed with. Sleep aids, anxiety medications, pills for disorders that exist in the gray area between psychological and neurological. The dates on the bottles span months, suggesting a relationship with healthcare providers I cannot recall establishing. The shower drain has begun to emit sounds at night, not quite music, not quite voices, but something that falls between the two. I've checked for blockages and found none. The plumber I called never arrived, though I distinctly remember scheduling the appointment and waiting by the phone for confirmation. The business card I used to contact them has faded until only the phone number remains legible. My bedroom closet contains clothes I don't recognize alongside familiar garments. The new items fit perfectly and match my taste, but I have no memory of shopping for them. Price tags have been carefully removed, and the fabric shows signs of wear, as if they've been part of my wardrobe for years. I find myself reaching for these mystery clothes more often than my known possessions. The street light stands steady now, but I've noticed other lights in the neighborhood have begun to flicker. The pattern spreads like a contagion, jumping from pole to pole with no apparent logic. My notebook now contains a map of the affected areas, a growing constellation of unreliable illumination that seems to center on my house. The municipal office claims no knowledge of electrical problems when I call to report the disturbances. Kitchen window still frames that original light, but this morning something new catches my attention. A figure stands beneath the steady glow, motionless as a statue facing my house. The distance makes identification impossible, but the posture suggests patience, as if they've been waiting there for some time. As I watch, they raise one hand in what might be a wave or might be something else entirely. When I blink, the space beneath the light is empty again, leaving me to wonder if I saw anything at all. Story 8. The morning fog clung to the windows like a reluctant visitor, softening the hard edges of the room. The gentle hum of the fridge was the only sound, a rhythmic pulse in the quiet kitchen. Yet amidst the usual clutter of half-read newspapers and scattered crumbs, the back door was ajar, swaying lightly as if guided by an invisible hand. Footprints traced a path on the dew-kissed tiles, stopping just at the threshold where the light dared not reach. The air held a stillness, an unsettling pause, as if waiting for a secret to surface. I remember thinking the coffee tasted different that morning, bitter in a way that made me wonder if I'd forgotten to clean the pot. The cup sat heavy in my hands, ceramic warming my palms while something cold settled in my chest. The newspaper lay folded, headlines I couldn't focus on bleeding into gray smears. The footprints were mine, weren't they? Memory plays tricks, I know this now. It bends and folds like origami, creating shapes that weren't there before. But that morning, standing in my kitchen with fog pressing against glass, I felt certain of nothing except the wrongness of everything. She used to leave notes on yellow paper, small squares torn from a pad, corners curled from humidity. They'd appear in unexpected places, tucked between coffee filters, slipped under the sugar bowl, pressed into the spine of whatever book I was reading. Simple messages, reminders about milk or appointments or the way light fell through the bedroom window at exactly 4 p.m. The last note said, "Check the garden shed." I found it 3 days after she stopped leaving them. 3 days of searching drawers and coat pockets, looking for those familiar yellow squares. When I finally discovered it, wedged behind the kitchen timer, the paper felt different, heavier. the handwriting slanted in directions I didn't recognize. The shed sits at the back of our property, past the vegetable garden where tomatoes hang like small red hearts. I used to avoid it. Too many shadows, too many corners where spiders built their patient webs. But that day, with the note burning in my pocket, I walked the stone path between the bean poles and turned the rusted handle. Inside, garden tools arranged with military precision. Bags of mulch stacked like sandbags, and on the workbench, a photograph I'd never seen before. Two people standing beside a lake. The woman looked familiar, something about her posture, the way she held her left shoulder slightly higher than her right. The man was a stranger. They were laughing at something beyond the camera's reach, their faces bright with shared secrets. I brought the photograph inside and placed it on the kitchen table. For 3 hours I stared at it while coffee grew cold and fog cleared from the windows. The woman's face resolved itself slowly, like a developing print in a dark room. Features I knew intimately, yet changed by context, by proximity to this unknown man. The phone rang twice that afternoon. Both times, silence on the other end, not the electronic silence of a dropped connection, but the breathing kind, someone listening, waiting. I held the receiver until the dial tone returned, then checked the locks on all the doors. That night I dreamed of yellow paper floating in dark water. She worked late on Tuesdays, always Tuesdays. Something about inventory or reports or meetings that couldn't be scheduled any other day. I'd learned not to ask for details. Her explanations had a rehearsed quality, too smooth, like stones worn by constant handling. But last Tuesday, I followed her. The word followed feels too deliberate. I prefer to think I happened to be driving in the same direction, making the same turns, stopping when she stopped. Coincidence stretched to its breaking point. She didn't go to work. Instead, she parked beside a small diner on the edge of town, the kind of place that serves coffee in thick white mugs and keeps pies under glass domes. Through the window, I watched her slide into a booth across from someone I couldn't see clearly. Just a figure in a dark jacket, hands that moved when they talked. I sat in my car for an hour, engine off, windows fogging with my breath. When she finally emerged, her face carried an expression I'd never seen before. Not happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it. Relief, maybe, or recognition. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every traffic light held us too long. Every turn revealed familiar streets that suddenly seemed foreign. In my rearview mirror, her headlights followed at precisely the same distance they always did, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The photograph from the shed began to move. Not literally, I'm not losing my grip on reality, not yet, but it seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. The man's smile would appear wider, the woman's hand closer to his arm, small alterations that made me question what I'd seen originally. I started keeping a journal, nothing elaborate, just observations written on whatever paper was handy. The back of envelopes, margins of newspapers, napkins from the diner where she met her mystery companion. I documented everything, the temperature of her coffee in the morning, how long she spent in the shower, which shoes she chose for work. Patterns emerged. On days when she hummed while getting dressed, she came home late. When she forgot to water the plants by the kitchen window, her phone would ring during dinner. Small correlations that might mean nothing or everything. The journal grew into a collection of fragments, scraps of paper scattered through the house like fallen leaves. I'd find my own handwriting in unexpected places, observations I didn't remember making. She touched her neck when lying about the grocery store. The car smells like cologne I don't recognize. Yellow notes have stopped appearing. One morning I woke to find all the fragments gathered on the kitchen table, arranged in neat rows like evidence at a crime scene. My handwriting stared back at me, accusing and familiar. I had no memory of collecting them, no recollection of this careful organization. But there they were. The shed photograph had companions now. 3 more pictures discovered in places I'd already searched. Behind books taped under drawer bottoms, folded inside the pages of old magazines. Different locations, same 2 people. Their relationship documented in stolen moments, sharing coffee, walking through what might have been a park, standing close enough that their shadows merged. In the most recent photograph, she wore the blue dress I'd bought for her birthday. The one she claimed to have donated months ago because it didn't fit properly. I began to understand that I was living inside a carefully constructed fiction. Each day scripted, each conversation rehearsed, each gesture calculated to maintain an illusion I'd been too trusting to question. The realization arrived not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow tide, inevitable and drowning. The yellow notes resumed appearing, but now I recognized them for what they'd always been, staged directions in a play where I was the only actor unaware of the script. Remember to buy milk really meant he's watching the grocery receipts. Don't forget the appointment translated to we need to be more careful. I stopped following the directions, let the milk run out, missed the appointments, ignored the gentle reminders that had once seemed like love. Instead, I began writing my own notes, questions on yellow paper left in the same places where hers had appeared. Who is he? How long did you ever love me? They disappeared overnight, replaced by responses I hadn't expected, her handwriting but different somehow. Sharper angles pressed deeper into the paper. You wouldn't understand. It's complicated. Love isn't the right word. The conversation continued for weeks, conducted entirely through these paper fragments. A relationship reduced to its essential elements: suspicion, confession, the careful negotiation of revealed truths. We spoke less during the day, as if all our real communication was happening in this secret language of yellow squares. Then the notes stopped completely. The house felt different without them, quieter but not peacefully so. The silence had weight pressing against my ears like deep water. I found myself checking the usual places obsessively behind the timer, under the sugar bowl, between the pages of books. But the yellow paper had vanished as suddenly as it had first appeared. She still went out on Tuesdays, still came home with that same expression of relief or recognition. But now she watched me watching her, awareness crackling between us like electricity before a storm. We'd moved beyond pretense into something more dangerous, acknowledged deception. The photographs multiplied, not new ones I'd stopped finding those, but copies. The same 4 images reproduced and scattered throughout the house like accusations. Taped to mirrors, slipped between dishes in the cupboard, pinned to the back of the bedroom door, as if the house itself was trying to tell me something I was too stubborn to hear. I gathered them all, every duplicate and copy, and arranged them chronologically on the kitchen table. A timeline of betrayal documented in stolen moments. The progression was clear: casual acquaintance becoming something deeper, public spaces giving way to private intimacy, careful distance collapsing into connection. But looking at them together, I noticed something else. Something that made my hands shake as I reached for the magnifying glass from the junk drawer. In the background of each photograph, barely visible but undeniably present, was a third figure. Someone watching from a distance, camera raised, documenting the documentation. The figure looked familiar. I spent the afternoon studying my reflection in the bathroom mirror, comparing it to the shadowy form in the photographs. The posture matched, the height seemed right, even the way I held my shoulders, slightly hunched from years of leaning over books and papers. Had I taken these photographs? Was I the observer I'd been searching for, the mysterious third party in this triangle of deception? The possibility felt both impossible and inevitable, like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known existed. Memory, I realized, was more fragile than I'd believed. It could be edited, revised, selectively erased. The mind was capable of protecting itself in ways that bordered on the miraculous, hiding truths too painful to acknowledge, creating stories more bearable than reality. But which story was true? The one where I was the victim of elaborate deception, or the one where I was the architect of my own confusion? The evidence supported both narratives equally, like a coin spinning in the air, showing both faces simultaneously. The fog returned that evening, pressing against the windows with familiar insistence. I sat in the kitchen, surrounded by photographs and fragments of yellow paper, trying to assemble the pieces of a puzzle that kept changing shape. Every answer led to new questions, every revelation cast doubt on previous certainties. She came home late, as I'd known she would. Her footsteps on the back porch were careful, measured, as if she was trying not to wake someone who might be sleeping. The door opened slowly, and she stepped into the kitchen where I waited with my collection of evidence spread across the table. She looked at the photographs without surprise, studied the yellow notes as if reading familiar correspondence. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no trace of guilt or defension, only a kind of weary recognition. "You found them all," she said. I wanted to ask who the man in the photographs was, how long the deception had been going on, why she'd chosen such an elaborate method of communication. But the questions felt suddenly irrelevant, like asking about the weather during an earthquake. Instead, I asked, did I take these pictures? She sat down across from me, her face softened by the dim kitchen light. For a moment, she looked like the person I'd fallen in love with before the yellow notes and secret meetings and carefully constructed lies. But the moment passed, and I saw her clearly, someone I'd never really known at all. "You don't remember," she said. It wasn't a question. The fog pressed harder against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of footsteps on wet tiles, approaching or retreating. I couldn't tell which. Story 9. I stood at the edge of the room, my eyes fixed on the hallway rug, noting the way it lay slightly askew, as if nudged recently. The distant tick of a vintage clock punctuated the silence, each second dripping with an eerie normalcy. Yet the air felt different today, charged with an unplaceable tension, as if holding its breath. Beneath the surface, a creak from the old floorboards echoed a rhythm I couldn't match to any ambient sound. I waited for the source to reveal itself, compelled by a sense of not yet knowing, a hovering absence more potent than presence. Then a single step pressed too heavy, a pressure that defied its silent surroundings. The knowing came later, though I suspect it had always been there, dormant beneath layers of ordinary conversation and shared meals. Perhaps it was the way the coffee cup sat on the kitchen counter that morning, positioned just so, with the handle turned away from where it should naturally rest. Small things accumulate like sediment, building into something substantial enough to disturb sleep. I find myself returning to the photograph again and again. The one tucked between pages of a book I'd never seen before, a volume about maritime navigation that appeared on our shelf without explanation. In the image, figures stand against a backdrop of weathered wood and rope, their faces partially obscured by shadow and the camera's angle. One figure wears a jacket I recognize, though the setting remains foreign to me. The ocean stretches behind them, endless and gray, holding secrets in its depths the way silence holds unspoken words. The first indication of wrongness might have been the phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. Or perhaps it was earlier, in the way certain conversations would shift direction like wind changing course, leaving me adrift in their wake. I began to notice patterns in the absence of patterns, the careful randomness of explanations that felt rehearsed. There was a suitcase in the closet that I'd never seen packed or unpacked. Inside, clothing folded with military precision, items that suggested travel to places where salt air clings to fabric long after return. A ticket stub, faded but readable, for passage on a vessel whose purpose remained unclear. The dates meant nothing to me then, just numbers on paper, but the texture of the ticket itself spoke of urgency, of decisions made quickly in dim light. I remember standing in that same hallway weeks before or after, watching shadows move across the wall in ways that didn't correspond to any visible movement. The rug had been straight then, aligned with the floorboards in perfect parallel lines. Order maintained through careful attention to detail, the kind of precision that suggests practice, rehearsal, the covering of tracks that haven't yet been made. The conversations I overheard through thin walls took on new meaning when I stopped trying to understand their content and focused instead on their rhythm. Urgent whispers punctuated by long silences, the kind of pauses that occur when someone is writing things down or checking details against a list. Names I didn't recognize spoken with familiarity, places that sounded far from our landlocked existence. Sleep became elusive, replaced by a hyper-awareness of sounds that had always been there but now demanded interpretation. The settling of old wood took on intentionality, each creak a footstep, each sigh of the house's aging frame a breath held too long. I found myself cataloging these sounds, creating mental maps of movement through rooms I thought I knew completely. The maritime navigation book became my obsession, its margins filled with penciled notes in handwriting that looked almost familiar but remained stubbornly foreign. Coordinates marked with tiny X's, routes traced in faint lines across charts of waters I couldn't identify. The book's spine was cracked in specific places, suggesting frequent reference to particular passages about tides and currents, about reading weather patterns and finding safe harbor. I began to understand that the wrongness hadn't begun recently. It had been growing like barnacles on a ship's hull, accumulating slowly until the vessel's movement through water became labored, inefficient. The signs had always been there, disguised as routine, camouflaged by the ordinary rhythm of shared domesticity. The photograph haunted me with its casual intimacy. These weren't strangers captured accidentally in frame, but people comfortable with each other's presence, familiar with the setting that meant nothing to me. I studied their posture, the way they stood in relation to each other and to the camera, trying to decode relationships that existed outside my understanding. There were receipts hidden in that maritime book, thin slips of paper that spoke of purchases made in coastal towns, payments for services I couldn't identify, fuel for vessels, provisions for extended voyages, equipment whose purpose remained mysterious but whose cost suggested serious intent. The amounts were significant, the kind of expenditures that require planning and justification. I started leaving small tests around the house. A book positioned just so on a table, a cup placed at a specific angle to the edge of the counter. These markers of my presence, tiny witnesses to disturbance. Some remained untouched for days, others shifted in ways that suggested careful handling, as if someone understood they were being observed and responded with equal precision. The weight of secrets has a physical presence. I felt it in the way certain rooms seemed smaller than they had before, compressed by the pressure of things unsaid. The air itself became dense with implication, each breath carrying the taste of salt that had no source, no reasonable explanation for its presence so far from any ocean. I found myself drawn to weather reports, particularly those concerning coastal conditions. Storm warnings took on personal significance, as if distant tempests might somehow affect the atmosphere in our landlocked rooms. I began to understand that geography is more fluid than maps suggest, that influence travels along invisible currents that connect all waters, all weathers, all secrets. The suitcase revealed more secrets when I finally gathered courage to examine its contents thoroughly. Beneath the carefully folded clothing lay documents in languages I couldn't read, official papers with stamps and seals that spoke of bureaucratic processes in foreign places. Photographs of harbors at dawn, vessels moored in misty light, figures moving cargo in the early morning hours when few witnesses are awake to observe. The pattern of deception became clearer through accumulated details rather than dramatic revelation. Like erosion, truth wore away gradually, revealing the bedrock of something I hadn't suspected. The careful choreography of daily life, the precise timing of arrivals and departures, the explanations that answered questions I hadn't asked but avoided those I had. I realize now that the rug in the hallway serves as a barometer of activity, its position indicating the passage of feet carrying burdens I'm not meant to know about. Each slight displacement tells a story of movement through darkness, of careful navigation around sleeping awareness, of routes planned to avoid detection. The vintage clock's ticking has become a countdown to something I can't identify. Its rhythm matches the pulse of anxiety that has taken residence in my chest, the steady beat of approaching revelation. I find myself listening for variations in its tempo, as if mechanical precision might falter under the weight of accumulated secrets. The maritime navigation book disappeared for several days, then returned to its place on the shelf with new annotations in its margins. Fresh coordinates marked in different ink, routes modified to account for changing conditions. Someone is still planning, still calculating distances and timing, still preparing for voyages that haven't yet begun or haven't yet ended. I understand now that my role in this unfolding mystery is that of unwitting anchor, providing stability while currents of deception flow around me. The weight of not knowing has become familiar, comfortable even, like the pressure of deep water that eventually feels natural to those who descend slowly enough to adapt. The photograph subjects seem to watch me now when I study their faces, their expressions holding knowledge that I'm only beginning to suspect. They stand at the edge of vast water, comfortable with depths that would terrify those of us accustomed to solid ground. Their secrets are safe with distance, protected by miles of salt water and years of careful practice. The creak of floorboards has developed new patterns, rhythms that suggest the weight of decision rather than simple movement. Each step carries intention, purpose that extends beyond the immediate geography of our shared space. I've learned to interpret these sounds as messages in a code I'm only beginning to understand. The air still holds that charge of tension, that sense of held breath waiting for release. The hallway rug lies askew again, nudged by passage that occurred while I slept or while I was distracted by the ordinary demands of daylight. The vintage clock continues its patient counting, marking time toward revelations that may never fully surface, secrets that may remain forever submerged in the deep waters of willful ignorance. I stand at the edge of the room again, my eyes fixed on the hallway rug, noting the way it lies slightly askew as if nudged recently. But now I understand that the displacement is intentional, a signal in a language I'm finally learning to read. The distant tick of the vintage clock no longer punctuates silence, but measures the rhythm of a dance I'm only now beginning to recognize. The air feels different today, charged not with unplaceable tension, but with the electricity of approaching storm, the pressure that builds before revelation breaks like waves against carefully constructed shores. Story 10. It used to echo every morning, a ritual as predictable as sunrise. I would hear the first 4 rings, each one distinct, cutting through the early silence with precision. It marked the dawn in unbroken succession, comforting in its constancy. But then last Tuesday, the pattern wavered, the 4th ring trailed off, leaving a peculiar void. The following day, the 3rd ring sounded dull, as if muffled, and today, the 5th ring never came at all. Yet the clock still ticks with its usual certainty, and I can't help but wonder what else is not as it should be. The chimes have always been my anchor to this place, to the rhythm that keeps the lighthouse functioning. Even now, as I sit in the lamp room watching the beam sweep across the dark water, I find myself counting the intervals between each rotation. 15 seconds, always 15 seconds. Some patterns hold, while others dissolve without warning. I've been the keeper here for what feels like a lifetime, though the exact duration blurs in my memory like fog rolling in from the horizon. The isolation doesn't bother me, never has. Ships pass in the distance, their lights blinking messages I've learned to read over the years. Cargo vessels heading north, fishing boats returning before dawn, the occasional yacht that strays too far from the shipping lanes. Each one follows its own pattern, its own predictable course. But patterns can lie. The woman arrived on a supply boat 3 weeks ago, or perhaps it was 4. Time moves differently out here, measured not in hours but in tides, in the rhythm of waves against the rocks below. She said she was a researcher, studying coastal erosion or marine biology, something scientific that required solitude and observation. The captain who brought her seemed eager to leave, barely waiting for her equipment to be unloaded before his engine was churning white foam in his wake. She set up her instruments along the rocky outcropping that extends from the lighthouse's base, metal devices that gleamed silver in the morning sun. I watched from the gallery as she moved between them, adjusting angles, taking notes in a leather-bound journal. Her movements were precise, methodical, like the chimes used to be. I offered her the guest quarters in the lighthouse's lower level, a small room that previous keepers had used for assistants or visiting inspectors. She accepted with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the kind of expression that makes you wonder what thoughts are moving beneath the surface. Her voice carried a slight accent I couldn't place, vowels shaped by geography I'd never visited. The first week passed without incident. She worked during the day, measuring things I couldn't see, recording data that meant nothing to me. In the evenings, she would sit on the rocks watching the sunset, her silhouette motionless against the changing sky. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of her from the lamp room, a dark figure that seemed to blend into the shadows as night fell. It was during the second week that I began to notice the changes. Small things at first, the way she would pause in her work to stare at the horizon, as if waiting for something that never appeared. The way she would stand at her window late at night, looking not out at the sea, but up at the lighthouse beam as it swept past. The way she began asking questions about the shipping schedules, about which vessels passed at what times. I told myself her curiosity was natural. Researchers ask questions, they observe, they document. but there was something in the way she listened to my answers, an intensity that made me feel as though my words were being weighed and measured, filed away for some purpose I couldn't understand. The chimes began their irregular behavior around this time, though I can't be certain of the connection. Correlation isn't causation. I learned that phrase somewhere, though I can't remember where. Still, the timing troubles me. For years, those bells had marked each hour with unwavering precision. Now they stumble and falter as if something has disrupted their internal mechanism. I examined the clock mechanism repeatedly, searching for loose gears or worn springs. Everything appeared normal. The weights hung at their proper positions, the pendulum swung in its steady arc. Yet the chimes continued their erratic performance, sometimes ringing too early, sometimes not at all. It was as if the clock had developed its own sense of time, independent of the hours it was meant to measure. During the third week, I began to notice that the woman's equipment had multiplied. What started as a few simple instruments had grown into an array of devices I couldn't identify. Some pointed skyward, others toward the sea. One appeared to be recording something, its digital display blinking red numbers that changed too quickly for me to read. When I asked about her expanding setup, she explained it was necessary for comprehensive data collection. Her smile was the same one she'd worn when she first arrived, polite, distant, concealing more than it revealed. The ships began to change their routes. It was subtle at first, variations so slight I almost dismissed them as natural adjustments for weather or current conditions. The cargo vessels that usually passed 2 miles offshore started coming closer, their lights visible with unusual clarity from the lighthouse gallery. The fishing boats that normally returned before dawn began arriving in broad daylight, their engines straining against loads that seemed heavier than usual. I mentioned these observations to the woman during one of our brief conversations. She listened with that same intense focus, nodding as if my words confirmed something she already suspected. When I finished speaking, she asked if I kept records of the ship traffic. I told her about the logbook, a leather-bound volume where generations of lighthouse keepers had recorded vessel sightings and weather conditions. Well, she asked to see it. I should have refused. The logbook was private, a record meant for maritime authorities and emergency responders, not for researchers studying coastal erosion. But something in her tone suggested that refusal wasn't really an option. I retrieved the book from its locked drawer and watched as she photographed page after page with a small digital camera. Her fingers traced the entries as she worked, following the careful handwriting of my predecessors. She lingered over certain passages, dates when unusual activity had been recorded, ships arriving at odd hours, vessels that appeared in the log without corresponding departure entries, nights when the lighthouse beam had been extinguished for reasons that weren't clearly explained. That night, the chimes rang 13 times at what should have been midnight. I counted each one, certain I was mistaken, but the 13th ring echoed across the water with the same clarity as the others. 13 chimes where there should have been 12. I checked the clock face, but it showed the correct time. Only the chimes had gone wrong, marking hours that didn't exist. From my window, I could see the woman standing on the rocks below, her face turned upward toward the lighthouse beam. She remained there for a long time, motionless in the salt wind, as if she were waiting for something to happen. When I looked again an hour later, she was gone. The next morning, I found her equipment rearranged. The devices that had pointed toward the sea now faced inland, toward the lighthouse itself. When I asked about the change, she said she was expanding her research to include structural vibrations and electromagnetic interference. The lighthouse, she explained, might be affecting her readings. I wanted to believe her explanation, but doubt had taken root in my mind like barnacles on the lighthouse's foundation. Each day brought new questions, new inconsistencies that didn't quite align with her stated purpose. Why did her research require photographs of the logbook? Why had the ship traffic patterns changed so dramatically since her arrival? Why did the chimes ring at impossible hours? The woman began spending more time in the lighthouse itself, claiming she needed to measure electromagnetic fields at different elevations. I would find her in the lamp room during my routine maintenance checks, standing beside the massive lens assembly with instruments I'd never seen before. She would smile and step aside, but I could feel her watching as I cleaned the lens surfaces and checked the rotation mechanism. It was during one of these encounters that I noticed something strange about the lighthouse beam. The light that had swept across the water in the same pattern for decades had developed an irregularity, a slight hesitation as it passed over a specific section of the horizon. The pause lasted only a fraction of a second, barely perceptible unless you knew the rhythm as well as I did. I mentioned this observation to the woman. She listened with that familiar intensity, then asked if I could show her exactly where the hesitation occurred. We climbed to the lamp room together, and I pointed toward the coordinates where the beam seemed to falter. She made notes in her leather journal, sketching diagrams I couldn't interpret. That night, ships began appearing in that exact location. Not one or two vessels, but a steady stream of lights moving slowly across the dark water, too far away to identify, too numerous to be coincidental. They seemed to be waiting for something, gathering like moths drawn to a flame that hadn't yet been lit. I watched through binoculars until dawn, counting more than 30 vessels of various sizes. By morning, they were gone. The woman acted as if nothing had happened. She went about her usual routine, checking her instruments and recording data in her journal. But I caught her glancing toward the horizon where the ships had gathered, and there was something different in her expression, satisfaction, perhaps, or anticipation. I began to suspect that her research had nothing to do with coastal erosion or marine biology. The equipment she'd brought was too sophisticated, too specialized for simple environmental monitoring. The questions she asked were too specific, too focused on the lighthouse's operational patterns and the shipping traffic that passed within sight of our isolated station. The chimes grew more erratic. Sometimes they would ring continuously for minutes at a time, their bronze voices echoing off the water in a cacophony that made no sense. Other times they would remain silent for entire days, leaving the lighthouse wrapped in an unnatural quiet that made every small sound seem amplified and significant. I started keeping my own journal, recording the woman's activities and the strange phenomena that had begun occurring since her arrival. The entries read like the observations of someone slowly losing their grip on reality, but I couldn't deny what I was witnessing. Ships appearing and disappearing, chimes ringing impossible hours, equipment that seemed to multiply overnight. The woman found my journal. I had hidden it in the lamp room, tucked behind a panel where spare bulbs were stored, but when I went to make my nightly entry, the journal was gone. I searched the entire lighthouse, checking every room and storage area, but found no trace of it. The woman said nothing about the missing journal, but her smile that evening carried a different quality, knowing, almost amused. I began to wonder if I was the one being studied. The possibility crept into my thoughts like fog rolling in from the sea, obscuring everything I thought I understood about the situation. What if her instruments weren't measuring coastal erosion or electromagnetic fields? What if they were measuring me? my routines, my reactions, my growing paranoia as the familiar patterns of lighthouse life dissolved around me. The ships returned, more numerous than before. This time they remained visible throughout the night, their lights forming patterns that reminded me of constellations rearranged by an unseen hand. I tried to photograph them, but my camera captured only darkness where the lights should have been. The woman's equipment, however, seemed to register their presence, red numbers flickering rapidly across digital displays, recording data I couldn't interpret. I confronted her about the ships. She listened patiently as I described what I'd seen, then suggested that the isolation might be affecting my perception. Long periods alone could create hallucinations, she said. The mind, deprived of social interaction, sometimes invented stimuli to fill the void. Her explanation was reasonable, delivered with the kind of professional concern I might expect from someone with scientific training. But it didn't account for the photographs in my missing journal, the documented changes in shipping patterns, the mechanical failure of chimes that had worked perfectly for decades. Unless those things had never happened at all. The thought terrified me more than any external threat. If my perceptions couldn't be trusted, if the changes I'd observed were products of an isolated mind creating its own reality, then everything I believed about the situation might be false. The woman might be exactly what she claimed to be, a researcher whose presence had coincided with, but not caused, my growing disconnection from reality. But the chimes were real. The mechanical failure was documented in the lighthouse's maintenance log, recorded in my own handwriting before doubt had taken hold. Unless I had falsified those entries as well, creating evidence for a conspiracy that existed only in my deteriorating mind. I stopped sleeping. The uncertainty was too overwhelming, the possibility of losing entire hours to dreams that might feel more real than waking experience. Instead, I spent the nights in the lamp room, watching the beam sweep across the water, counting the seconds between rotations. 15 seconds, always 15 seconds. At least that pattern remained constant. The woman's research entered its final phase. She began dismantling some of her equipment, packing instruments into cases that seemed too small to contain them. When I asked about her departure schedule, she said the supply boat would return soon. Her work was nearly complete. I felt a mixture of relief and dread, relief that the strange phenomena might end with her departure. Dread that I might discover the problems had nothing to do with her presence, that the failing chimes and altered shipping patterns would continue long after she was gone, proving that the source of the disturbance lay within my own fractured perception of reality. On her final night, the chimes rang once at sunset, a single clear note that echoed across the water with perfect clarity, then silence. Not the mechanical failure I'd grown accustomed to, but complete, intentional quiet, as if the clock had decided its long service was finished. The woman stood on the rocks below, her equipment packed and ready for transport. The supply boat appeared on the horizon as the last light faded from the sky, its engine cutting through the darkness with familiar reliability. She boarded without ceremony, offering only a brief wave as the vessel turned toward the mainland. I watched until the boat's lights disappeared, then climbed to the lamp room to begin my solitary vigil once again. The lighthouse beam swept across empty water, marking time in 15-second intervals. The ships had vanished with the woman's departure, leaving only the endless rhythm of waves against stone. But the chimes remained silent. I examined the clock mechanism again, searching for obvious damage or wear. Everything appeared normal, gears meshed properly, Springs maintained their tension, the pendulum swung in its steady arc. Only the chiming mechanism had failed, leaving the clock to mark time in visual silence. Perhaps that was for the best. The erratic ringing had become a source of anxiety, each unexpected chime a reminder that familiar patterns could dissolve without warning. Now the lighthouse operated in quiet efficiency, its beam sweeping across the water without audible accompaniment. Yet I found myself listening for sounds that didn't come, counting hours that passed unmarked. The silence felt heavier than the broken chimes, pregnant with possibilities I couldn't name. Sometimes I would wake from brief naps convinced that I'd heard the familiar bronze voices, only to find the lighthouse wrapped in the same profound quiet. The maintenance log showed no record of the woman's visit. I searched through pages I was certain had contained her information, arrival date, research purpose, equipment inventory, but found only routine entries about weather conditions and vessel sightings. Either I had never recorded her presence, or someone had removed the relevant pages with surgical precision. My own journal remained missing. Without it, I had no proof that the strange events had occurred at all. The woman might have been a hallucination, a product of isolation and routine that had created its own internal logic. The ships, the equipment, the conversations, all of it might have existed only in the space between waking and sleeping, between reality and the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of solitude. But the chimes were still broken. That much was real, documented in maintenance records that predated any doubt about my mental state. The mechanical failure had occurred, even if everything else was questionable. Something had changed, even if I couldn't trust my memory of how or why. I settled back into the old routines, tending the lighthouse beam and recording weather observations. Ships passed in the distance, following predictable routes that made sense according to commercial schedules and seasonal patterns. The horizon remained empty of mysterious gatherings, the water clear of unexplained lights. Yet I found myself watching for signs of return, not the woman specifically, but some indication that the strange interlude had been real, that my perceptions could still be trusted. Each supply boat raised brief hope, each unusual weather pattern suggested hidden significance. The lighthouse beam continued its steady rotation, casting light across water that revealed nothing more than waves and darkness. 15 seconds between sweeps, a rhythm as reliable as sunrise, as predictable as the chimes used to be. I began to understand that certainty was a luxury I could no longer afford. The boundary between observation and imagination had blurred beyond recognition, leaving me in a space where truth was whatever remained consistent from one day to the next. The lighthouse beam, the rotation interval, the sound of waves against stone. Everything else was subject to revision. The clock still ticks with its usual certainty, marking hours that pass in silence. I've grown accustomed to the quiet, to the absence of bronze voices that once divided time into manageable portions. But sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I think I hear them again, 4 distinct rings cutting through the early silence with precision. When I check the clock face, it shows the correct time. The mechanism functions perfectly, gears meshing in their eternal dance, pendulums swinging with mechanical reliability. Only the chimes remain silent, their voices lost to whatever force disrupted their ancient rhythm. And I can't help but wonder what else is not as it should be.